It was the dawn of September 7th, 1822. The air along the banks of the Ipiranga River shimmered in the tropical sun, and a young man on horseback sat deep in thought. His name was Dom Pedro, son of the King of Portugal. But that morning he was more than a prince. He was the weight of a nation waiting to be born. Brazil at that time was no ordinary colony. It stretched wider than all of Western Europe combined, filled with vast forests, golden coasts, and people from every corner of the earth. For more than 3 centuries, it had served as Portugal's glittering jewel, its sugar and gold feeding European empires. Yet beneath the wealth lay a quiet tension, an ache to be something more. The Napoleonic Wars had turned Europe upside down. When Napoleon's armies invaded Portugal in 1807, the Portuguese royal family fled across the ocean to Rio de Janeiro, the only European monarchy ever to rule from the Americas. For 13 years, Brazil became the heart of the Portuguese Empire. Palaces rose, universities opened, trade blossomed, and Rio transformed into a cosmopolitan capital of carriages, chandeliers, and powdered wigs. But when the danger in Europe passed, King João II sailed back to Lisbon in 1821, leaving his son Pedro as regent. To the people of Brazil, this was no longer a colony. It had tasted the privileges of being a kingdom and could not be forced back into subservience. Letters began arriving from Lisbon, cold, commanding, and filled with arrogance. The Portuguese Cortes ordered Dom Pedro to return immediately, to dissolve local institutions, and to once again place Brazil under the authority of Lisbon's bureaucrats. It was an insult. The Brazilian elites, the farmers, and the soldiers whispered one word among themselves: independence. Pedro, however, was torn. His blood was Portuguese, but his heart belonged to Brazil. He rode across the countryside, speaking with landowners, governors, and the common folk. Everywhere he went, he heard the same plea: stay, Prince Pedro, stay, and make Brazil your home. By early September 1822, the tension had reached its breaking point. While riding back from Sao Paulo, a messenger arrived breathless, carrying another decree from Lisbon. It demanded his immediate return to Europe. Pedro dismounted, unfolded the letter, and read it under the burning sun. His face tightened. Around him, soldiers watched in silence. Then, in one thunderous cry that would echo through the ages, he drew his sword and shouted, "Independência ou morte! Independence or death!" That moment on the banks of the Ipiranga River marked the birth of the Empire of Brazil. News spread like wildfire. Bells rang in Rio. Farmers dropped their tools and cheered. In towns and villages, people wept openly, unsure what independence would bring, but certain that something sacred had begun. A few weeks later, on October 12th, Pedro was proclaimed Emperor Dom Pedro Tormes of Brazil, the first and only monarch ever crowned in the Americas. His coronation glittered with gold, incense, and music, yet there was uncertainty behind the smiles. A new nation had been born, but it was fragile. Its unity stretched across jungles, mountains, and thousands of miles of coastline. Dom Pedro's task was immense. He needed to transform this enormous land into a functioning empire, to give it laws, borders, and a voice in the world. The Constitution of 1824, one of the most liberal of its time, declared Brazil a constitutional monarchy, granting rights of citizenship and representation. It was a promise of modernity wrapped in royal tradition, but peace did not come easily. Revolts flared across the provinces, some demanding more autonomy, others rejecting imperial control altogether. In the north, the Confederation of the Equator rose in defiance. In the south, border wars simmered with Argentina. Each rebellion tested the young empire's will to survive. And yet, through it all, Pedro held fast. He believed in Brazil's destiny, to be not a colony, not a republic of chaos, but a civilized empire standing proudly among nations. He built alliances, expanded trade, and sought recognition from Europe. Slowly, other countries acknowledged Brazil's sovereignty. The British, always pragmatic, were among the first to do so. Still, beneath the gold and grandeur, there were cracks. The economy depended heavily on slavery. Millions of African men and women brought against their will to labor on sugar and coffee plantations. The empire's birth had not freed them. It was an independence of the few, not yet of the many. Dom Pedro's reign grew troubled. His decisions angered the parliament. His loyalty to Portugal, especially after his father's death, sparked distrust. By 1831, exhausted and isolated, he abdicated in favor of his young son, Dom Pedro II, and sailed away to Europe, his dream unfinished, yet his legacy immortal. Brazil, however, endured. Against the odds, it remained united while Spanish America splintered into pieces. The empire he created would stand for 67 years, guiding Brazil through wars, prosperity, and reform. And so, the birth of the Empire of Brazil was not just a political act, it was an emotional awakening. It was a cry from the heart of a continent that wished to define itself, not through revolution alone, but through continuity, culture, and vision. When the night falls over Rio today, the echo of that cry, Independencia ou Morte, still lingers in the humid air. It speaks of courage and contradiction, of a young prince who chose the unknown path for the sake of a land he had come to love. History would call it independence. Brazilians would call it destiny. Ah, there you are. Settle in, my sleepless ruler. The candles are low, the night is quiet, and the air is thick with stories yet to be told. Tonight, we do not travel to deserts of sand and myth, but to a land of impossible green, a place where a European crown fled to hide from the world's most fearsome emperor. It is a story of how a continent-sized colony accidentally became the heart of its own empire, all because of a frightened prince and a fleet of ships racing across the sea. Before you get too comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you truly enjoy what I do here. Now let us begin. Our story does not start under the warm Brazilian sun, but in the cold, damp dread of Lisbon in November of 1807. A relentless rain is falling, turning the cobblestone streets into murky streams that reflect the panicked torchlight. The city holds its breath, for the armies of Napoleon Bonaparte are marching, and they are terribly, dreadfully close. The Emperor of the French, that great and terrible puppet master of Europe, had issued an ultimatum, and Portugal, ancient and proud and allied with the English, had failed to comply. Now, the price was to be paid. In the royal palace, there is not the stoic calm of a monarchy preparing for a heroic last stand, but the frantic, undignified chaos of a household packing in a terrible hurry. The man at the center of this storm, the one upon whose shoulders the fate of a global empire rested, was not a warrior king. He was Prince Regent Dom João, ruling in the name of his mother, Queen Maria Pariente, who had long ago succumbed to a profound and tragic madness. Dom João was a portly man, cautious to a fault, known more for his love of chicken legs and sacred music than for decisive action. He was plagued by indecision, a quality that court gossips sharpened their teeth on. And now he faced a choice that would have paralyzed even the most resolute of kings. Stay and fight a hopeless battle against Napoleon's legions, surely losing his throne and his life, or commit the most unthinkable act for a European monarch, to abandon his kingdom, his people, his very homeland, and flee. Historians, my ruler, still debate this moment. Was it an act of supreme cowardice, a king turning his back on his subjects to save his own skin? Or was it a stroke of strategic genius, a checkmate against Napoleon that no one saw coming? By moving the entire apparatus of the state, the court, the treasury, the archives, to its wealthiest colony, Brazil, was Dom João not preserving the Portuguese crown so it could live to fight another day? Perhaps the truth is somewhere in between. Perhaps it was a desperate gamble made by a man who saw no other way out. Whatever the motive, the decision was made. The court would flee. The ensuing scramble was a spectacle of organized pandemonium. Imagine, if you will, nearly 15,000 people, the entire royal family, powdered and perfumed nobles, their countless servants, ministers of state, judges, clerks, military officers, all trying to pack centuries of accumulated wealth and privilege onto a hastily assembled fleet. Crates of gold and diamonds from the colony were hauled back onto the ships, a strange homecoming for Brazil's riches. The entire royal library, 60,000 precious volumes, were unceremoniously bundled up and carried through the mud to the docks. It was a nation's brain and heart being ripped out and put into storage. All the while, the ordinary people of Lisbon watched in stunned disbelief. Their rulers, the divine symbols of their world, were leaving them to face the French alone. The rain did little to wash away the bitter taste of abandonment. The voyage itself was a 9-week nightmare. The ships were dangerously overcrowded, with aristocrats accustomed to sprawling palaces now crammed into tiny, damp cabins. A vicious storm scattered the fleet early in the journey, adding terror to the misery. Food spoiled, fresh water ran low, and a lice infestation swept through the noble passengers, forcing the women, in a great act of collective humiliation, to shave their heads and take to wearing simple turbans. One can only imagine the conversations, the whispered complaints of duchesses and viscounts, who had never known a moment of physical discomfort in their lives, now sharing their space with rats and their meals with weevils. It is, perhaps, a small cosmic joke that the price of saving their titles was to live, for a time, like the commonest of sailors. Finally, in January of 1808, the shores of Brazil appeared on the horizon. The fleet first docked in Salvador, in the province of Bahia. The colonists were dumbfounded. For 300 years, the monarch had been a distant, almost mythical figure, a name on a document, a face on a coin. To suddenly have the Prince Regent and his entire court appear in their harbor was like a storybook coming to life. They descended from the ships, pale and seasick, into a world of vibrant color, stifling humidity, and the overwhelming scent of tropical blossoms and ocean salt. Dom João, ever the pragmatist, immediately made a decision that would change Brazil forever. He signed a decree opening the colony's ports to trade with friendly nations, which really meant Great Britain, whose warships had conveniently escorted the fleet. In a single stroke of a pen, the mercantile system that had kept Brazil a closed-off resource farm for Portugal was shattered. But Bahia would not be the final destination. Dom João had decided the new seat of his empire would be further south, in Rio de Janeiro, and if Rio was unprepared for its destiny, it certainly did not know what was about to hit it. At the time, Rio was a colonial backwater. A beautiful one, to be sure, nestled between dramatic, green-sheathed mountains and the sparkling blue of Guanabara Bay, but a backwater nonetheless. Its streets were narrow, unpaved, and filled with filth. There was no sanitation to speak of, and the city lacked the basic infrastructure and housing to accommodate its own population, let alone thousands of Portuguese nobles. When the court arrived, chaos gracefully descended. The best houses in the city were summarily requisitioned for the newcomers. Soldiers would simply knock on a door and paint the letters PR on the front for Príncipe Regente. This meant the owners were to vacate the premises immediately. The citizens of Rio, known then as now for their sharp wit, quickly came up with a new meaning for the acronym Ponha-se na rua, which translates, more or less, to get yourself onto the street. It was a quiet, sarcastic rebellion, the only kind available to them. An entire class of wealthy colonists found themselves unceremoniously displaced, forced to move in with relatives or into far humbler accommodations, all to make way for a court that seemed to have descended upon them like a flock of demanding, overdressed seagulls. And yet, through all this disruption, something incredible was happening. Rio was being transformed. The arrival of the court was an injection of pure adrenaline into the city's heart. Dom João, for all his personal quirks, began building the institutions of a modern state. He established a royal press, a medical school, a national bank, and using those 60,000 books hauled across the ocean, the Royal Library. Artists and architects and scientists from Europe were invited to this new tropical capital. Brazil, and Rio in particular, was no longer a peripheral part of a distant kingdom. It was now the kingdom's center, its brain, its beating heart. The colony was becoming the metropole. The child was becoming the parent. As the years passed under that warm sun, the memory of Lisbon's cold rain began to fade for the transplanted court. They were far from Napoleon and the endless wars of Europe. Here, a new world was being born, a future empire stirring in its cradle. But it was a birth fraught with contradictions. A kingdom built in a colony, a European court going native in the tropics, and a society of immense wealth built on the backs of hundreds of thousands of enslaved people. The seeds of both Brazil's future glory and its deepest sorrows were all being planted in those chaotic first years, and the young son of Dom João, a boy named Pedro, was watching it all, learning what it meant to rule in a land that was unlike any other on earth. And his story, my ruler, is one we shall save for the nights to come. And so, my ruler, the royal court of Portugal settled into its new, sun-drenched reality. More than a decade passed. The memory of that frantic escape from Lisbon, a detail you might recall from our last night together, had softened into a well-worn anecdote told over games of cards and glasses of sweet wine. An entire generation of young nobles was now coming of age who knew more about the calls of tropical birds than the chimes of Lisbon's cathedrals. Rio de Janeiro had blossomed under its royal patronage, shedding its skin as a humble colonial port to become a true imperial city, a tropical Versailles, where life was sweet, the fruit was plentiful, and the politics of old Europe felt blessedly far away. Dom João, no longer a mere prince-regent but now King João VI, presided over this strange, transplanted world with his customary cautious placidity. It seemed as if this comfortable arrangement might last forever. But the world has a habit of knocking on the doors of even the most secluded palaces. In 1820, news arrived on a ship from Lisbon, news that traveled at the speed of wind and sail, but hit with the force of a cannonball. A revolution, a mostly bloodless one thankfully, had swept through Portugal. It was called the Liberal Revolution, and it was led by military officers and merchants, tired of being governed from afar by an absolute monarch, all while their country was effectively a British protectorate. They had formed a new government, the Cortes, and they had written a constitution. And they had two very clear demands for their absent king: return to Lisbon at once and swear an oath to rule not by divine right, but by the laws of their new constitution. The long, strange holiday was over. A tremor of anxiety ran through the court in Rio. Return to a cold, rainy Lisbon, a country economically ruined by years of war, and a new government that wanted to put limits on their king's power. It was a deeply unappealing prospect. Here in Brazil, the sun was warm, their authority was absolute, and the coffee was excellent. To go back felt like a demotion. This reluctance, you see, revealed a quiet truth. They were no longer simply Portuguese nobles temporarily living abroad. They had become Brazilian. The colony had changed them as much as they had changed the colony. For the Brazilian-born elites, the landowning class that had grown rich from the open ports King João had granted, the news was not just unappealing, it was terrifying. The Cortes in Lisbon spoke of Brazil not as a co-kingdom, but as a colony to be put back in its place. They wanted to revoke its new privileges, to once again shackle its trade for the sole benefit of the mother country. The word they all feared, the one whispered in salons and government offices, was recolonization. At the center of this web sat the king, João VI, a man once again trapped by history. If he defied the Cortes and stayed in Brazil, he would almost certainly be deposed in Portugal, losing half his kingdom. If he returned to Lisbon and accepted their terms, he risked losing Brazil, whose people were growing dangerously fond of their elevated status. It seemed his fate was to be perpetually caught between a rock and a very warm tropical place. He dithered and delayed, as was his nature, hoping the problem might somehow resolve itself. But the pressure only mounted, both from Lisbon and within Rio itself, where factions began to form and protests filled the squares. And in this moment of crisis, all eyes began to turn to his son, the crown prince, Dom Pedro. Pedro was now a young man, and he was nothing like his father. Where João was cautious and rotund, Pedro was impulsive and athletic. Where João was a creature of the old world's traditions, Pedro was a product of the new. He had arrived in Brazil as a boy of 9 and had grown into a man on the vibrant, chaotic streets of Rio. He raced horses, composed music, and had a well-known fondness for the company of beautiful women. He was charming, headstrong, and more than a little wild. Crucially, he spoke with a Brazilian accent, and he saw the world through Brazilian eyes. The people of Rio adored him. They saw in him not a foreign prince, but one of their own. He was the living symbol of this new Brazilian identity, a bridge between the Portuguese blood in his veins and the Brazilian soil under his feet. As his father wavered, Pedro was drawn deeper into the political fray. He became the great hope of the Brazilian party, a loose coalition of landowners, merchants, and liberal thinkers, many of them Freemasons, who were determined that Brazil would not give up an inch of the autonomy it had gained. They saw in Pedro a leader who could secure their future. The Portuguese-born courtiers and military officers, meanwhile, pushed for a full return to the old ways, demanding the king and the prince both submit to the Cortes. The city simmered. The tropical paradise was becoming a political pressure cooker, and Pedro was right in the middle of it. Finally, in April of 1821, the king could delay no longer. The Cortes was threatening, and troops in Rio were bordering on mutiny. He made his choice. He would return to Portugal to save his crown, but he would leave his son, Pedro, to govern Brazil as Prince Regent. In a moment of extraordinary foresight, or perhaps cynical calculation, he gave his son a piece of parting advice. The story goes that he pulled Pedro aside and said, "My son, if Brazil is to break away from Portugal, let it be under you who will respect me, rather than under one of these adventurers." It was a quiet acknowledgement of the inevitable, a father giving his son permission to tear the kingdom in two, so long as he kept the pieces in the family. The departure was as chaotic as the arrival had been 13 years prior, but this time it was tinged with bitterness. The king was not just taking his court, he was taking the treasury. In a final parting act of staggering self-interest, Dom Juan VI ordered the Bank of Brazil, an institution he himself had founded, to be completely emptied. Crate after crate of gold, silver, and currency was loaded onto the ships, leaving the Brazilian treasury utterly bankrupt. It was as if he was presenting a bill for his 13-year stay, a bill so large it would cripple his son's new government before it even began. A sort of royal dine and dash on a national scale, and then they were gone. The fleet of ships carrying the old king and his court became white specks on the blue Atlantic horizon, sailing east toward a past that Brazil had already outgrown. On the shore stood Prince Pedro, just 22 years old. He was now the master of a kingdom-sized territory on the verge of a nervous breakdown. He was besieged on all sides. The Cortes in Lisbon began issuing decrees to undermine his authority and dismantle Brazil's institutions, treating him like a provincial governor, not a prince regent. The Brazilian patriots, meanwhile, were urging him to resist, to defy his father's homeland, to declare himself for Brazil and Brazil alone. He stood caught between his duty as a son and a Portuguese prince, and his destiny as the leader of a new nation waiting to be born. The choice was his, and the entire world was watching to see what he would do. The air was thick with the coming storm, and a cry for freedom was building, ready to erupt from the banks of a quiet river called Ipiranga. The ships carrying the old king had long since vanished into the haze of the Atlantic. My ruler, leaving his son, Prince Pedro, standing on the shores of a kingdom in all but name. As we left him, he was a man caught in a political tide, with the currents of his Portuguese duty pulling one way, and the immense swelling wave of Brazilian identity pulling the other. He would not have to wait long for that tide to become a torrent. The news and decrees that continued to arrive from the Cortes in Lisbon were not the letters of a government seeking compromise, but the commands of a master to a servant who had forgotten his place. The politicians in Portugal, you see, were trying to turn back time. They systematically began to dismantle the institutions Dom Juan had built, ordering the closure of courts and bureaus. They decreed that the remaining Brazilian provinces should no longer answer to Rio de Janeiro, but directly to Lisbon, effectively splintering Pedro's authority. The final insult, the one that truly fanned the embers of rebellion into a flame, was a direct order for Pedro himself to return to Portugal for the supposed completion of his political education. No one was fooled. This was not an invitation to study. It was a summons for a subordinate. They meant to pluck him from Brazil like a troublesome weed, leaving the colony once again headless, voiceless, and pliable. It was a profound miscalculation, a failure to understand that Brazil was no longer a child to be ordered back to its room. The Brazilian people reacted with a unified and furious spirit. Petitions began to circulate. gathering thousands upon thousands of signatures, all begging the prince to stay, to defy the Cortes, to be their defender. The pressure mounted until one fateful day in January of 1822. From the balcony of the Paço Imperial in Rio, overlooking a vast and anxious crowd, Prince Pedro received the formal petition. He read their words, felt their desperate hope, and made his choice. He stepped forward and spoke the simple, revolutionary words that would change everything. Se é para o bem de todos e felicidade geral da nação, estou pronto. Digam ao povo que fico. If it is for the good of all and the general happiness of the nation, I am ready. Tell the people that I shall remain. The crowd erupted. Fico! I shall remain! The day became known as the Dia do Fico, a landmark moment of open defiance. There was no going back. With that single declaration, Pedro had crossed his Rubicon. He was no longer Lisbon's man in Rio. He was Rio's man against Lisbon. Guiding him through these treacherous political waters were two figures of immense importance. The first was his chief minister, José Bonifacio de Andrada y Silva. He was a brilliant worldly man, a naturalist and philosopher who had spent decades in Europe, yet his heart was fiercely Brazilian. He was the intellectual architect of independence, a steady hand on the tiller, channeling Pedro's impulsive energy toward a clear and calculated goal. The second, and perhaps most crucial, was Pedro's wife, the Archduchess Maria Leopoldina of Austria. Do not picture her as a passive princess, my ruler. Leopoldina was a Habsburg, raised in the most politically astute court in Europe. She was highly intelligent, well-read, and possessed a keener political mind than most of the men who surrounded her husband. She saw with perfect clarity that Brazil's destiny was independence, and she became its most ardent champion within the palace walls, urging her husband to embrace his historic role. In August, Pedro traveled to the restive province of São Paulo to secure support and calm political rivalries, leaving Leopoldina to rule as regent. It was a decision that placed the fate of the nation directly into her hands, for it was during his absence that the final, most infuriating letters arrived from Portugal. One stripped José Bonifacio of his power, and another charged Pedro's government with treason. There was no more room for diplomacy. Leopoldina convened the Council of State. With the full backing of José Bonifacio, she did something extraordinary for a woman of her time. She signed a formal recommendation that Brazil declare its independence immediately. Then she dispatched a messenger to ride day and night to find her husband. It is a peculiar feature of history that so many nations owe their existence to the speed of a horse and the stamina of a single, unknown rider. And so we arrive at the 7th of September, 1822. The scene is not a grand palace or a battlefield, but the muddy bank of a small, insignificant stream called Ipiranga. Dom Pedro and his entourage are on their way back from the coast, tired, hot, and dusty. The Grand Imperial Guard, which would later be depicted in glorious paintings, was in reality a small, sweaty honor guard. At this unremarkable spot, the messengers from Rio finally catch up to him. They deliver the packet of letters, the latest threats from the Cortes, and the urgent, decisive letters from his wife and his minister telling him the time for talk was over. Pedro read the documents, his expression hardening. He looked at the words from Lisbon, which treated him like a disobedient boy. He looked at the words from Leopoldina, which urged him to become a king. Everything, the flight from Portugal, the Dia do Fico, the hopes of an entire people, had led to this single quiet moment by a muddy river. The official story, the one immortalized in portraits and taught to school children, is a masterpiece of theater. It tells us that Dom Pedro, filled with righteous fire, turned to his guard, dramatically ripped the Portuguese blue and white insignia from his uniform, raised his sword to the heavens, and delivered the immortal cry, "Independencia ou morte," independence or death. But history, my ruler, is rarely so tidy. The grand painting of this moment, a national treasure, is a beautiful piece of propaganda. Historians now give us a far more human picture. Pedro was not on a magnificent steed, but most likely a humble mule, a much more practical choice for long journeys on rough roads. He was not in a pristine dress uniform, but in dusty travel clothes. And, according to the diaries of his companions, he was suffering from a rather undignified case of intestinal distress, having made several stops along the road that day. The great cry of independence was probably less of a heroic proclamation and more of an angry, frustrated shout from a man who was hot, tired, suffering from stomach cramps, and had simply had enough. The reality is often less cinematic, but perhaps more relatable. He had been pushed too far, and he finally pushed back. Whether it was a polished oration or a visceral outburst, the words had the same effect. They were a declaration of war and the birth certificate of a nation. As Pedro and his men rode on toward Sao Paulo, they were no longer representatives of the Portuguese crown. They were the first patriots of the independent empire of Brazil. That shout, on the banks of a forgotten stream, was the severing of the final tie. A new empire was now proclaimed, one of the largest in the world, born not in a great battle, but in a moment of frustration on a dusty road. But a proclamation is one thing. To make it real, a war would still have to be fought, and an emperor would need to be crowned. The cry was over. The work had just begun. That single furious shout by the Ipiranga River, "My ruler," was like a starting gun fired in a vast and silent stadium. It was a moment of pure, cathartic release. But a shout is not a country, and a declaration is not a fact. As news of the cry for independence spread, carried by weary horsemen across Brazil's immense distances, the reaction was not one of universal celebration. In Rio de Janeiro, there was jubilation. But in the northern provinces, particularly in wealthy Bahia, a bastion of Portuguese loyalism, the military garrisons stood firm. They were soldiers of the King of Portugal, and they answered to the Cortes in Lisbon, not to a rebellious prince in Rio. Independence had been declared, but it would have to be won. Pedro returned to Rio a hero, the liberator of a new nation. On his 24th birthday, in October of 1822, he was officially acclaimed emperor. A few months later, he was crowned in a ceremony of hurried but spectacular grandeur. Imagine the scene: the young emperor, tall and dashing, kneeling in the new imperial chapel, a crown crafted of gold and diamonds from Brazil's own mines placed upon his head. Cannons boomed across the bay, their smoke mixing with the salty air. He was no longer just Dom Pedro of the House of Braganza. He was Dom Pedro I, constitutional emperor and perpetual defender of Brazil. The title was a promise, a blend of old-world monarchy and new-world liberalism. It was a promise that would prove terribly difficult to keep. While the new emperor was being crowned, a real war was being fought. It was a scattered, messy conflict, fought in port cities and across the northern plains. The fledgling Brazilian army was no match for the professional Portuguese troops. Pedro, ever the pragmatist, knew he needed a navy. He did what many new nations did in that era. He went shopping for one. He hired the services of Lord Cochrane, a brilliant, daring, and famously insubordinate Scottish naval officer who had a knack for winning wars for burgeoning South American countries. Cochrane, with a tiny ragtag fleet, worked miracles. Through a series of audacious bluffs and clever maneuvers, he convinced the much larger Portuguese forces that they were hopelessly outmatched, securing city after city for the emperor. By the end of 1823, the last Portuguese loyalists had been driven from Brazilian soil. The war was won. The vast territory, unlike its Spanish-speaking neighbors, which fractured into a dozen different republics, was now unified under a single crown. With the threat of Portugal removed, the great domestic task could begin: the writing of a constitution. An assembly of 90 elected deputies was convened, a gathering of the finest minds in Brazil, filled with lawyers, priests, and landowners who were steeped in the liberal ideals of the Enlightenment. And here, the new emperor, the hero of independence, met his first true adversary, the very men who had helped him create his nation. They gathered to write the rules for the new empire, and they had a very specific vision. They imagined an emperor who was a symbol, a figurehead, the living embodiment of the nation's unity. But they did not envision an emperor who would actually rule. The constitution they began to draft, which became known as the Cassava Flower Constitution, for its requirement that voters have a certain income measured in bushels of flour, was a direct challenge to Pedro's authority. It made the legislature supreme. The emperor would not be able to veto their laws. He could not dissolve their assembly. His ministers would be beholden to them, not to him. In essence, they were offering him a job that consisted mostly of wearing splendid uniforms and posing for portraits, while they got on with the actual business of running the country. Pedro was incandescent with rage. He saw himself as the liberator, the founder, the very soul of Brazil. He had risked everything to break free from Lisbon. He would not, he famously fumed, become a gilded slave to a parliament of lawyers. The clash of wills between the emperor and the assembly paralyzed the government. The Andrada brothers, including Pedro's former mentor José Bonifacio, led the assembly's charge, becoming the emperor's most vocal opponents. Newspapers, a new and vibrant force in Rio, took sides, publishing fierce articles attacking either the deputies or the emperor. The mood in the capital grew dark and tense. Pedro believed the assembly was trying to sow chaos and strip him of the power the people had given him. The assembly believed the emperor was a tyrant in waiting, a man who spoke of liberty but craved absolute power. Finally, in November of 1823, the emperor's patience snapped. He decided to end the debate in the most direct way imaginable. On a cool evening, the city of Rio watched as imperial troops, loyal only to Pedro, surrounded the building where the Constituent Assembly was in session. This was the night of agony. The deputies inside debated and argued, but they were trapped. The next day, the emperor formally dissolved the assembly by military force. The doors were locked, and its most prominent members, including the great José Bonifacio, were arrested and unceremoniously sent into exile. It is, one must admit, a very effective, if somewhat impolite method of winning a political argument. The hero of the Dia do Fico had now become the man who silenced the elected voices of his people. But Pedro did not see himself as a tyrant. He saw himself as a savior, rescuing the nation from political chaos. He did not abandon the idea of a constitution. He simply decided to write one himself. He appointed a new council of state, filled with men loyal to him, and within weeks they produced the Imperial Constitution of 1824. This document was not created by the people's representatives. It was outorgada, or granted, by the emperor to his subjects. And at its very heart was a remarkable and uniquely Brazilian political invention. It created the three familiar branches of government, the legislative, the executive, and the judicial. But then it added a fourth, standing high above all the others, the poder moderador, the moderating power. This power belonged to the emperor and the emperor alone. It gave him the authority to mediate any and all political disputes. He could dissolve the Chamber of Deputies, he could dismiss ministers, he could appoint senators for life. He was not just a part of the government, he was its guardian, its referee, its ultimate arbiter. It was a brilliant solution for ensuring stability, and it placed immense, almost absolute power into his hands. Brazil now had its constitution. The empire had its rules, but the cost was high. In forging his empire, Pedro had revealed an iron fist beneath his liberal velvet glove. The man who had drawn his sword for liberty had used it to shatter his first parliament. This deep contradiction, my ruler, between the liberator and the autocrat, would lie at the very heart of his reign, a struggle that would define his rule and ultimately bring it to an end. With a new constitution in hand, one that you will recall was written more by the emperor than for him, the Brazilian Empire seemed to have settled its foundations. Dom Pedro Wurst, armed with his unique and formidable moderating power, stood as the unquestioned authority over a vast, unified, and now peaceful nation. The political storms of the independence struggle had passed, and the future seemed to hold the promise of stability and growth. But empires, my ruler, are restless things, and the quiet on one border is often just the drawing of a breath before a storm begins on another. The first great foreign test for Pedro's new empire would come not from the old world of Europe, but from the windswept grasslands to the south. The land in question was a beautiful rolling territory nestled between the Uruguay River and the Atlantic Ocean. To the Spanish-speaking world, it was the Banda Oriental. To Brazil, it was the Provincia Cisplatina. Today, we know it as Uruguay. For centuries, this land had been a line in the sand, a buffer and a battleground between the Portuguese and Spanish crowns. Pedro's own father, the cautious Dom João VI, had formally annexed the province into the Portuguese kingdom just a few years before independence, a final imperial acquisition. Now it was part of Brazil. On a map, it looked like a neat and tidy fact. But the people who lived there, the proud and fiercely independent Orientales, felt otherwise. They did not see themselves as Brazilian, and they had long memories of their connections to their Spanish-speaking neighbors in Buenos Aires. In the spring of 1825, a spark landed in this dry political tinder. A small band of 33 exiles, led by a man named Juan Antonio Lavalleja, crossed the wide expanse of the Rio de la Plata. They were the legendary 33 Orientales, and they came to light a fire. Their rebellion spread like a wildfire across the plains, and they quickly sought the aid of the United Provinces of the Rio de la Plata, the nation we would come to know as Argentina. The government in Buenos Aires, which had always seen the Brazilian annexation as a theft, was only too happy to help. They gave the rebels their full support, and soon the conflict escalated from a provincial uprising to a full-blown war between two of South America's largest powers. For Emperor Pedro, this was an intolerable affront. He was the perpetual defender of Brazil, and this was Brazilian land. To lose it would be a sign of weakness, an immediate stain on the prestige of his new empire. He, a man who had never seen a battlefield, was confident. Had he not just overseen a successful war to expel the Portuguese? This regional squabble should be no different. Brazil declared war, and the emperor expected a swift, decisive campaign that would teach the upstarts in Buenos Aires a lesson and secure his southern border for good. He was to be bitterly disappointed. The war on land was a disaster. The Brazilian Imperial Army was, to put it gently, a work in progress. It was a force composed largely of unwilling conscripts, literally rounded up from towns and farms in a hated practice known as recrutamento a lasso, recruitment by lasso. These poorly trained, poorly equipped, and entirely unmotivated soldiers were sent to fight highly skilled gaucho cavalry on their home turf. The result was a series of humiliating defeats. The Brazilian infantry could not cope with the hit-and-run tactics of the horsemen of the Pampas. The war that was supposed to be a short, glorious affair turned into a bloody, expensive, and unwinnable quagmire. The Cisplatine province was proving to be one of those troublesome pieces of land that seemed to bring nothing but misery to anyone who tried to claim it. Back in Rio, the war was profoundly unpopular. The common people felt no connection to this distant struggle over a Spanish-speaking province. All they saw were their sons being dragged from their homes to fight and die on a dusty plain hundreds of miles away. To pay for the conflict, the government, its treasury already thin after Dom João's parting withdrawal, simply printed more money. Inflation soared, and the price of food and goods climbed ever higher, squeezing a populace that was already poor. The emperor also hired German and Irish mercenaries to fill his ranks, a move that deeply offended the growing sense of Brazilian nationalism. The conflict became known simply as Pedro's War, a personal dynastic struggle that had little to do with the Brazilian people, but for which they were forced to pay in both blood and coin. While the army floundered on land, the Brazilian navy, still under the command of skilled foreign officers, fared better. It established a tight blockade of Buenos Aires, strangling the Argentine economy. The result was a perfect and ruinous stalemate. Brazil could not win on land. Argentina could not break the blockade at sea. Both nations were slowly but surely bankrupting themselves, pouring what little treasure they had into a war that neither could win. And when two nations in a region of strategic importance fight themselves to a standstill, you can be sure a third, more powerful nation will soon invite itself to the negotiating table. That nation, of course, was Great Britain. British merchants dominated the trade in South America, and this endless war was bad for business. Acting as the era's indispensable global mediator, and with both Brazil and Argentina deeply in debt to British banks, London offered to oversee a peace treaty. The solution they brokered in Montevideo in 1828 was a stroke of cold, pragmatic genius, and a source of deep frustration for both sides. The Cisplatin province would not go to Brazil. It would not go to Argentina. Instead, it would become an entirely new and independent country, the Oriental Republic of Uruguay. It was the geopolitical equivalent of two children fighting so bitterly over a toy that a parent simply takes it away and declares it belongs to itself, or in this case, to nobody. A buffer state, beholden to no one, would keep the two rivals apart, and most importantly, keep the rivers open for British ships. And so the war ended, not with a bang, but with the scratching of a diplomat's pen. Pedro had lost. He had lost a province, he had lost a vast amount of money, and he had lost the unquestioning adoration of his people. The emperor who had set out to prove the strength of his new empire had succeeded only in exposing its profound weaknesses. The cheers of his coronation had faded, replaced by the quiet, persistent grumbling of a nation growing weary of its leader's ambitions. The failure in the South cast a long shadow over his throne, a shadow that would only deepen in the years to come. The failed war in the South, my ruler, was more than just a military defeat. It was a crack in the very foundation of the emperor's authority. A war, you see, can be forgiven if it is won. A lost war, however, leaves behind a bitter residue of debt, death, and disillusionment. Dom Pedro, I returned from that misadventure not as a conquering hero, but as a monarch whose judgment was now openly questioned. The money wasted, the lives lost, the national pride wounded. These things lingered in the public mind, a poison that began to seep into every other aspect of his reign. And unfortunately for Pedro, there were many other aspects that were already beginning to sour. While the emperor's public prestige was crumbling, his private life was providing the gossips of Rio with an endless feast. For years, he had been carrying on a flagrant and passionate affair with a woman named Domitila de Castro, whom he had elevated to the title of Marchioness of Santos. This was not a quiet, discreet dalliance. Pedro was besotted. He showered her with gifts, titles, and palaces, placing her at the very center of court life. And all of this was done under the nose of his wife, the Empress Leopoldina. She, the intelligent Habsburg Archduchess who had been so instrumental in the push for independence, was now subjected to constant public humiliation. The people of Brazil adored Leopoldina. They saw her as a virtuous, devoted mother and a true patriot. In their eyes, she was the soul of the new empire, while the emperor's mistress was a grasping intruder. This private drama became a public tragedy in 1826, when the empress, still young, fell ill and died. The exact cause was likely an infection, but the public had already written its own story. They saw a woman broken-hearted and mistreated by a callous husband. Rumors flew that her final illness had been brought on by a violent, jealous rage from the emperor. Her funeral procession was a spectacle of profound, silent grief that transformed into a massive, passive protest against Pedro himself. He had not just lost his wife, he had lost the heart of his people. Leopoldina was instantly elevated to the status of a martyr, and Pedro, the liberator, was recast in the public imagination as a petty, cruel tyrant. At the very same time his domestic world was collapsing, a dynastic crisis an ocean away began to consume all of his attention. His father, Dom Juan II, died in Lisbon. This made Pedro, for a brief time, not only Emperor of Brazil, but also King Pedro IV of Portugal. Faced with the impossibility of ruling both, he abdicated the Portuguese throne in favor of his young daughter Maria. He arranged for her to marry his own brother, Dom Miguel, who would act as regent. But Miguel was an ambitious man. He seized absolute power for himself, deposing his young niece and fiancée. This betrayal enraged Pedro. The fight to restore his daughter to the Portuguese throne became a personal obsession, a family feud that he pursued with all the resources of the Brazilian state. He seemed to forget he was the emperor of a struggling new nation in the Americas. His heart and mind were now in Lisbon, trying to run an empire in Brazil while micromanaging a civil war in Portugal proved to be, to say the least, an inefficient use of his time. This Portuguese distraction was the final fatal error. The people of Brazil, who had fought to free themselves from Portugal, now watched in disbelief as their emperor spent their money and spilled their ink on a European squabble. The very issue that had made him a hero, his Portuguese blood, which gave him the legitimacy to declare independence, now became his greatest liability. He was seen as a foreigner at heart, a man using Brazil as a stepping stone to reclaim his family's power in the old country. The Brazilian liberals, whom he had already alienated when he dissolved the Constituent Assembly, now had their ultimate proof that he could not be trusted. The cry of Brazil for Brazilians grew louder, and it was a cry that now defined the emperor as the enemy. The end came not as a single event, but as a rapid series of collapses. The editor of a critical newspaper was assassinated, and the emperor's allies were widely blamed. Pedro took a trip to the province of Minas Gerais, hoping to rally support, but was met with cold silence and streets decorated with symbols of mourning. When he returned to Rio, his Portuguese supporters threw a party to welcome him, which quickly devolved into a massive street brawl with Brazilian nationalists. This event, known as the Noite das Garrafadas, the Night of the Bottle Fights, was a symbol of the utter breakdown of order and the deep chasm that now separated the emperor from his people. In his final weeks, he was a man entirely alone. He tried to appoint new, more liberal ministers to appease his critics, but his authority was so shattered that no one of respectable standing would serve him. The military, once his staunchest ally, now signaled that it would not act against the people to save his throne. He was isolated in his palace, a prisoner of his own crumbling authority, the thunderous cheers of his coronation having faded into the hostile shouts of the mob outside his gates. In the dark, early hours of April 7, 1831, Dom Pedro finally accepted the inevitable. He sat at his desk and, with a few strokes of his pen, ended his tumultuous 9-year reign. There was no grand speech, no final address to the nation he had created. There was only a short, almost petulant letter of abdication. "I declare," he wrote, "that I have voluntarily abdicated in favor of my dearly beloved and esteemed son, Dom Pedro de Alcantara." It was a stunningly brief farewell from the man who had shouted, "Independence or death!" Under the cover of darkness, the first emperor of Brazil, the liberator, the founder of the nation, slipped out of his palace and onto a British warship. He was sailing back to Europe to fight for his daughter's throne, leaving his own behind. And on that throne, he left his son, a small, serious Brazilian-born boy of 5 years old. The founder had abandoned his creation, leaving a child to rule over a bankrupt, fractured, and deeply uncertain nation. An empire now rested on the shoulders of a boy who could barely see over the palace balcony. When the British warship carrying Dom Pedro slipped over the horizon, it left behind a profound and unnerving silence. Brazil, a nation born from the will of one man, was now an empire without an emperor. The crown, that great symbol of unity and authority, now rested on the theoretical head of a 5-year-old boy. You will recall, my ruler, that this was the child Dom Pedro had left behind, his son and heir, Dom Pedro de Alcantara. The boy was now Pedro II, a monarch who needed help getting dressed in the morning, the sovereign ruler of a territory larger than all of Europe. He was the anchor of the nation, but he was an anchor too small and light to keep the great ship of state from being tossed about in the coming storm. The constitution that his father had so forcefully imposed on the nation now presented a very difficult problem. It clearly stated that in the absence of an adult monarch, the country would be governed by a regency until the emperor reached the age of 18. This meant Brazil was facing more than a decade of provisional rule, a long and dangerous power vacuum. The moment the father sailed away, the politicians of Brazil, who had been united in their opposition to him, immediately began to fight amongst themselves. The central question was no longer how to limit the emperor's power, but who would get to wield it in his name. 3 factions quickly emerged from the fray, circling the empty throne like hungry wolves. First were the restauradores, the restorationists. These were the die-hard conservatives, mostly Portuguese merchants, who wanted the old emperor Pedro I to return. Then there were the exaltados, the exalted liberals. They were the radicals, the dreamers, Republicans at heart who saw this as a golden opportunity to push for more provincial autonomy, perhaps even to dissolve the monarchy altogether and create a federal republic. And in the center, holding the balance of power, were the moderados, the moderate liberals, They represented the powerful coffee-growing oligarchs of the southeast. They had no desire for a republic, which they feared would lead to chaos and slave rebellions, but they were determined to preserve the monarchy as a constitutional system where a strong parliament, which they controlled, held the real power. The initial solution was, as is so often the case with politics, governance by committee. A series of triumviral regencies was established, placing the executive power of an entire continent into the hands of 3 men at a time. After the singular, often impulsive will of Dom Pedro I, this was a dramatic change. It was also, predictably, chaotic. The triumvirs spent most of their energy arguing with each other and fending off plots from the other factions. Brazil had rid itself of an autocrat, only to discover the unique paralysis that comes from having too many hands on the tiller, all trying to steer in different directions. The great political experiment of the era was a constitutional amendment in 1834, known as the Ato Adicional, the Additional Act. It was a bold attempt by the moderates to appease the federalist demands of the exaltados and prevent the country from tearing itself apart. The act granted the provinces their own elected legislative assemblies, giving them a taste of home rule. It also abolished the arch-conservative Council of State and replaced the triumvirate with a single regent, who would be elected for a 4-year term. The first man to hold this new powerful office was a priest named Diogo Antonio Feijó. He was a stern, energetic liberal, but his attempts to impose order were met with failure as rebellions began to erupt across the country. He was soon replaced by his great rival, Pedro de Araújo Lima, a conservative who initiated the regresso, a return to a more centralized system, attempting to claw back the powers the provinces had been given. The nation's politics swung like a pendulum between the liberal dream of autonomy and the conservative fear of disintegration. To combat the growing unrest, the Regency created a new institution in 1831, the Guarda Nacional, the National Guard. On the surface, this was a citizen militia meant to keep the peace, but in reality, it was a brilliant political move by the landed elites. Control of the National Guard was not given to the central government in Rio, but to the local municipalities. This meant that the real power, the men with the guns, was in the hands of the wealthy local landowners, the coronéis. They were now the law in their own regions, able to raise what were essentially private armies to protect their interests. The government, in trying to secure order, had ended up formally decentralizing military power, making the regional oligarchs stronger than ever before. And while the nation outside was consumed by this political firestorm, a very different world existed within the walls of the imperial palace. Here, the young emperor, Dom Pedro II, lived a life of quiet, monastic discipline. He was being meticulously groomed for his future role. His days were a relentless succession of tutors and lessons, from dawn until well after dusk. He studied languages, sciences, history, art, and philosophy. He was being shaped into the ideal monarch, a philosopher king, the living embodiment of reason and justice. While his country was descending into chaos, the boy was learning about the virtues of stoicism and the principles of constitutional law. He was likely the only person in the palace who wasn't scheming for power, far more interested in his collection of seashells than in the raging debates that bore his name. By the end of the 1830s, the Regency was failing. The decentralizing experiment of the Additional Act had not brought peace. Instead, it had fanned the flames of separatism. Bloody civil wars, which we shall speak of on our next night together, were now raging from the Amazonian north to the Gaucho south. The conservative reaction of the Regresso was only making matters worse, alienating the liberals without truly restoring central control. Brazil seemed to be on the verge of splintering, of following its Spanish-American neighbors into a collection of warring states. The men who had governed in the emperor's name were at an impasse, their authority in tatters. And so, in this moment of supreme crisis, the feuding politicians, moderates and liberals alike, began to look toward the silent palace. They looked at the tall, serious 14-year-old boy who spent his days with books, and a truly radical idea, a solution that was both illegal and brilliant, began to take shape. What if the Constitution was just a piece of paper? What if the problem was not the system, but the absence of the symbol at its heart? What if, they whispered to each other, they didn't have to wait for the emperor to become a man? What if they could simply declare that he was one? The political theater in Rio, my ruler, with its squabbling factions and revolving door of regents, was not merely a palace drama. It was the calm, deceptive eye of a hurricane. As we saw, the men trying to govern in the young emperor's name were weak and divided. And in the vast expanse of Brazil, that weakness was a signal. It was an open invitation for every simmering grievance, every regional resentment, and every desperate dream of a better life to boil over. The decade of the Regency was not a time of peace and political experimentation. It was a decade of fire and blood, a time when Brazil nearly ceased to exist. The regents in the capital must have felt they needed a very large map, covered in pins, just to keep track of which part of their nation was actively trying to leave or consume itself in a given week. The first and most terrible of these fires erupted in the far north, in the immense isolated Amazonian province of Grão-Pará. This was the Cabanagem. It was not a political revolt of liberal ideas. It was a raw, visceral explosion of the dispossessed. The province was home to a tiny elite of wealthy Portuguese merchants and a vast, impoverished population of indigenous peoples, former slaves, and mixed-race river dwellers known as the Cabanos, the cabin dwellers. For years, they had suffered under a system of near slavery and absolute neglect. The power vacuum in Rio gave them their chance. What followed was one of the bloodiest and most tragic episodes in Brazil's history. The Cabanos rose up, capturing the provincial capital of Belém and declaring their own government. But their rage was uncontainable, and the revolt descended into brutal infighting and horrific violence. The response from the central government was merciless. An imperial force was sent not to negotiate, but to exterminate. The war lasted for 5 years, and the repression was absolute. When the smoke finally cleared, somewhere between 30 and 40,000 people were dead, a staggering portion of the province's population. It was a chilling message from Rio. The unity of the empire would be maintained, even at the cost of a massacre. Thousands of miles to the south, in the vibrant city of Salvador in Bahia, another very different rebellion broke out. This was the Sabanada. It was not a revolt of the poor, but of the urban middle class. Doctors, lawyers, journalists, the very liberals who felt betrayed by the conservative turn of the Regency. They seized control of the city and did something peculiar. They declared a new, independent Bahian republic, but with a condition. Their republic, they announced, would exist only until the young emperor Pedro II finally came of age. It was a rebellion against the regents. In the name of the emperor they were supposed to be serving. This curious loyalty to the boy monarch did them little good. The imperial forces besieged the city, and after a brutal fight, the Sabanada was crushed, its leaders executed or exiled. And yet another fire was lit, this one in the province of Maranhão. It was called the Baleada, a complex, chaotic uprising of cattle herders, runaway slaves, and poor artisans against the powerful local landowners. For 3 years they fought the imperial forces, another desperate struggle from below that was, in the end, drowned in blood. But the longest, most serious, and most romanticized of all the Regency revolts took place on the windswept southern plains of Rio Grande do Sul. This was the Guerra dos Farrapos, the War of the Ragamuffins. The people of this province were the Gauchos, a proud and independent culture of cattle ranchers and cowboys. They felt a deeper connection to their neighbors in Uruguay and Argentina than they did to the distant tropical court in Rio. Their grievance was primarily economic. The central government had placed heavy taxes on their main product, shark or dried beef, making it difficult to compete. Feeling ignored and exploited, the wealthy ranchers who led Gaucho society declared independence in 1836, founding the Rio Grandense Republic. This was no desperate peasant uprising. It was a well-organized, decade-long war of secession, led by charismatic figures and fought by some of the finest cavalrymen in the world. They proudly adopted the name their enemies gave them, the Farrapos or Ragamuffins, and for 10 years they ran their own country, even attracting international figures like the Italian revolutionary Giuseppe Garibaldi to their cause. The empire poured troops and resources into the south, but could never fully defeat them. The war dragged on, a constant bleeding wound on the empire's southern flank. It was a war fought over taxes and pride that lasted a decade, only to end, years later, with a negotiated peace, a full amnesty, and a promise of better treatment, proving that sometimes the longest fight is just a prelude to a handshake and a better deal. For the men in Rio, this cascade of rebellions was the ultimate nightmare. The Cabanagem, the Sabanada, the Balayada, the Farrapos, each was a symptom of the same disease, a lack of a central unifying authority. The nation was fraying at every seam. The great fear that had haunted the Brazilian elite since independence, that their nation would shatter into a dozen small, warring republics like their Spanish-speaking neighbors, seemed to be coming true. All their political maneuvering, their triumvirates, and their additional acts had failed to bring peace. They had only brought chaos. The decade of fire had burned away all their other options. It proved in their minds that a committee could not rule Brazil. The law could not rule Brazil. Only a monarch could. Only the sacred, almost mystical figure of the emperor could serve as the center of gravity to hold this vast and fractured world together. The problem was, their emperor was still a boy. But as the rebellions raged and the country bled, the politicians in Rio began to think that perhaps, for the good of the nation, the boy would simply have to grow up a little faster than expected. The decade of fire and blood we spoke of last, my ruler, had left the Brazilian Empire scarred and exhausted. While the great Ragamuffin War still raged in the south, a fragile, tense quiet had settled over the other provinces. The conservative regent, Pedro de Araújo Lima, ruled from Rio, his government committed to a policy of regresso, a return to centralized power. But it was the peace of a sick room, a quiet born not of health, but of weariness. The political system was in a state of paralysis. The regency, which you will recall was the constitutional solution to having a child emperor, had proven to be a disastrous failure. It had failed to inspire unity, failed to bring peace, and had governed over a decade of near disintegration. The nation was adrift, and the politicians were out of ideas. Or rather, the conservative politicians were. The opposition Liberal Party, however, found itself backed into a corner, and it is from such corners that the most radical ideas often spring. The Liberals saw the conservative regency as a slow-acting poison, choking the life out of the country with its rigid centralization. They saw their own political fortunes dwindling. They needed to break the deadlock, to seize power from their rivals, but they had no legal path to do so. And so, out of this desperation, they concocted a plan. It was a plan so audacious, so contrary to the Constitution, that it could only be described as a stroke of political genius. Their argument was simple and powerful. The problem with Brazil was not the monarchy. It was the absence of the monarch. The regency, a committee of fallible factional politicians, could never command the respect and loyalty that the figure of the emperor could. The rebellions, the chaos, the division, all of it, they argued, was a result of this empty center. The solution, therefore, was not to reform the regency, but to abolish it altogether. The solution was to enthrone the emperor. There was, of course, the small, inconvenient detail of the law, which stated that the emperor would only attain his majority at the age of 18. At the time, Dom Pedro II was just 14. The liberal plan was to simply ignore that fact. Their new slogan became "Majority Now." It was a curious political platform, my ruler, when the only solution you can offer for a country in chaos is to hand it over to a 14-year-old. To advance their cause, the liberals formed the Club of the Majority and launched a masterful public campaign. They presented the idea not as the political power grab it so clearly was, but as a selfless, patriotic act to save the nation. They painted a romantic picture of the young emperor, the solitary student in his palace, as the only one who could rise above the petty squabbles of the politicians and unify the country. This was a narrative the Brazilian people were desperate to believe. The idea of the monarch as a sacred, moderating power was already a potent one, and the liberals tapped into this deep cultural current. Their strategy was brilliant. It put the conservatives in an impossible position. How could they argue against putting the emperor on the throne without sounding like they were against the emperor himself? And what of the boy at the center of this storm? Young Pedro was no longer the small child his father had left behind. At 14, he was already tall for his age, with fair hair and serious blue eyes. His life, as we have seen, had been one of rigorous, isolated study. He was quiet, shy, and possessed a solemn dignity that made him seem far older than his years. He was undoubtedly aware of the political intrigue swirling around his name, of the men who spoke of him as a savior. Whether he was a passive pawn in their game or a quiet, willing participant is a matter of some debate. The most likely truth is that he was a serious-minded boy who had been told his entire life that his destiny was to save this country, and when the moment came, he simply accepted the role he had been groomed to play. In July of 1840, the liberal conspiracy reached its climax. They formally proposed a motion in the General Assembly to declare the emperor's majority. The debate was furious. The conservatives argued it was an illegal coup. The liberals argued it was a national necessity. Outside, the streets of Rio filled with people, whipped into a frenzy of anticipation by the liberal press, all chanting for their emperor. The political pressure became unbearable. The regency was crumbling. Finally, a delegation of senators and deputies, the leaders of the majority movement, made their way to the imperial palace of São Cristóvão. They were granted an audience with the prince. Imagine the scene, a room filled with the most powerful men in the country, all eyes on a single shy teenager. They formally presented their request. They told him that the nation was on the brink of collapse, that the regency had failed, and that only his immediate ascension to the throne could restore peace and unity. They then asked him if he, a boy of 14, would be willing to accept the full burdens of power. Pedro's response was brief and, according to legend, surprisingly decisive. He did not waver. He simply said, "Quero ha, I want it now." Perhaps it was a line fed to him by his tutors. Perhaps it was a flicker of the iron will he would later become famous for. Or perhaps it was simply the weary acceptance of a boy who knew this day was always coming. Whatever the truth, it was the answer the politicians needed. They raced back to the assembly building, the emperor's consent acting as the seal of approval on their coup. The news was announced, and the motion passed with overwhelming support. The regency was officially declared over. At the age of 14 years and 8 months, Dom Pedro II was now the reigning emperor of Brazil in both name and fact. When he appeared before the public, the overjoyed crowd in Rio unhitched the horses from his imperial carriage and pulled it through the streets themselves in a jubilant procession. The politicians had won their gamble. They had broken the Constitution to, in their eyes, save the nation. They had ended a decade of chaos by placing a child on the throne, investing all their hopes and the future of an entire empire in the untested wisdom of a shy, serious boy. Now, all of Brazil, from the war-torn plains of the south to the pacified jungles of the north, held its breath. The boy emperor was now in charge. The great question was, what on earth would he do next? The politicians who orchestrated the majority coup, my ruler, had placed a 14-year-old boy on the throne as a solution to their own political problems. They saw him as a symbol, a living flag, a charismatic figurehead behind whom they, the seasoned and ambitious men of the Liberal Party, could finally govern. They assumed that the shy, bookish boy would be putty in their hands. They were, in this assumption, profoundly mistaken. They had not accounted for the quiet, unbending core of duty that had been forged in the young emperor during his long, lonely years of study. They had crowned a boy, but they would soon find they were dealing with a will of iron. To cement this new reality in the minds of the people, to wash away the stain of a decade of chaos and rebellion, a grand coronation was planned. It took a full year to prepare. In July of 1841, the now 15-year-old Dom Pedro II was formally crowned in a ceremony of almost overwhelming opulence. The celebrations went on for weeks. There were balls, parades, triumphal arches, and fireworks. It was the most spectacular public festival Brazil had ever seen. The expense was enormous, but the purpose was clear: to project an image of unshakable stability, of ancient tradition, and of absolute legitimacy. It was a national exercise in collective belief, an attempt to make the impossible, the rule of a teenager over a continental empire, seem not just possible but natural and divinely ordained. The man at the center of this spectacle was a universe away from the passionate, swashbuckling figure of his father. You will recall that Pedro I was a man of impulse, of grand romantic gestures and scandalous affairs. His son was his opposite in nearly every way. Pedro II was formal, reserved, and relentlessly studious. His passion was not for romance but for knowledge. He was a scholar who happened to be an emperor. His work ethic was legendary. He would rise before dawn and often work late into the night, reading state papers, meeting ministers, and devouring books on every conceivable subject. He was fascinated by the new sciences of his age, especially the magical art of photography. He corresponded with intellectuals across the globe, from Friedrich Nietzsche to Louis Pasteur. He saw his role not as a ruler by divine right, but as the first citizen of his nation, a servant of the state whose duty it was to steer his people toward progress and enlightenment. Shortly after his coronation, the duties of state turned to a matter of dynastic urgency. Marriage. An emperor needed a wife to produce an heir and secure the succession. A suitable bride was found in the Italian peninsula, Princess Teresa Cristina of the Two Sicilies. Negotiations were conducted, contracts were signed, and the princess set sail for Brazil, a bride for an emperor she had never met. And here, my ruler, we have one of history's more painfully awkward first dates. The young Pedro had been shown a miniature portrait of the princess, a painting that was, to put it kindly, creatively flattering. He was expecting a beauty. When he went to greet his bride aboard her ship, he was met by a woman who was kind and gentle, but also plain, short, and who walked with a noticeable limp. The teenage emperor was so visibly shocked and disappointed that he had to turn away. For a moment, the entire arrangement hung in the balance. His courtiers whispered frantically, reminding him of his duty. And it was duty, that great guiding star of his life, that won out. He went through with the marriage. What began in that moment of crushing disappointment, however, blossomed into one of the great royal love stories of the 19th century. It became a partnership of deep, quiet affection and unwavering mutual respect that would last for nearly 50 years. Teresa Cristina was as reserved as her husband. She had no interest in politics, preferring to devote her life to her family, to sponsoring archaeology, and to charitable works. She became a beloved maternal figure to the Brazilian people, the mother of Brazilians, and she created a stable, loving home that the emperor, who had essentially grown up an orphan, had never known. With his domestic life settled, the young emperor turned to the art of governance, and he began to wield the most powerful tool his father had left him, the moderating power, with a subtlety and skill that no one expected. He did not use it as a cudgel to enforce his own will. Instead, he used it as a scalpel to balance the political life of the nation. He presided over a system with two great political parties, the liberals and the conservatives. They were not so different in their policies. Both represented the interests of the wealthy, slave-owning elite, but they were fierce rivals for power. Pedro II established a rhythm. He would allow one party to govern for a time, and when they inevitably ran into trouble or became too arrogant, he would use his authority to dismiss the prime minister and invite the opposition to form a new government. He kept the political pendulum swinging, ensuring neither side could dominate, and that both were ultimately dependent on his imperial favor. His first great triumph as a ruler was the pacification of his empire. The last and longest of the Regency-era rebellions, the War of the Ragamuffins, was still smoldering in the south. Pedro's government appointed a new commander to handle the situation, the brilliant and diplomatic Luis Alves de Lima e Silva, who would become the Duke of Caxias. Instead of seeking a bloody victory, Caxias was empowered by the emperor to seek an honorable peace. He offered the rebels a full amnesty, integration of their officers into the imperial army at their current ranks, and respect for their regional pride. In 1845, after a decade of war, the Ragamuffins laid down their arms and peacefully rejoined the empire. It was a masterful act of reconciliation, and it solidified the emperor's image as the unifier and peacemaker of Brazil. By the end of the 1840s, the storms had passed. The boy who had been thrust onto the throne to be a mere symbol had proven himself a capable and intelligent ruler. The rebellions were over, the political system was stable, and the court was a model of sober decorum. A long and steady reign had begun. But this new era of peace and stability, my ruler, rested on a dark and deeply troubled foundation. For the coffee plantations that were beginning to enrich the empire were worked by nearly 2 million enslaved human beings. And this great moral contradiction was a problem that the scholar on the throne could not ignore forever. The scholar had taken the throne. The last great rebellion of the Regency, the War of the Ragamuffins, had been brought to a peaceful and honorable conclusion. As the middle of the 19th century dawned, a fragile peace settled over the vast Brazilian empire. But the end of open warfare, my ruler, does not mean the end of conflict. It simply means the battle has moved indoors. The new emperor's great challenge was no longer to pacify rebellious provinces, but to tame the ferocious ambitions of the politicians in his own capital. He had to learn how to manage the storms of the court, storms that could be just as dangerous as any civil war. The political world of the Second Reign was dominated by two great parties, the Conservatives and the Liberals. Now do not let their names mislead you into imagining two groups with deeply held, opposing philosophies. In truth, both parties were drawn from the exact same social class, the wealthy, land-owning, slave-holding rural aristocracy. They were, in essence, two rival clubs of the elite, fighting for the grand prize of controlling the state, its offices, and its patronage. A famous political saying of the time put it best: "There is nothing more like a conservative," it went, "than a liberal in power." The joke held a deep truth. Their greatest ideological difference was often the simple question of which of them got to sit in the ministerial chairs. Pedro II, you will recall, had been placed on the throne to be the great unifier, the impartial figure who could stand above these factions. And he took this role to heart. He saw that if one party held power for too long, the other, feeling permanently excluded, might be tempted to resort to the rebellions and conspiracies that had defined the chaotic Regency period. His great task was to create a system that allowed these two rival groups to share power peacefully, to take their turns at the feast without ever breaking the dinner table. And the solution he presided over was a unique and ingenious political machine, a system that has been called parliamentarism in reverse. To understand its strange genius, first picture a normal parliamentary system, like the one in Great Britain. The people vote to elect members of parliament. The party that wins the most seats forms the government, and its leader becomes the prime minister. Power flows upwards from the voters to the government. Brazil, under Pedro II, turned this entire idea completely upside down. Power did not flow up from the people. It flowed downwards from the emperor. Here is how the emperor's great game was played. It would begin with him, the great arbiter, observing the political scene. When he decided that the ruling party, let us say the Conservatives, had become unpopular or corrupt, or had simply been in power long enough, he would use his moderating power. First, he would dismiss the conservative prime minister and his entire cabinet. The government would fall, not because it lost a vote in parliament, but because the emperor wished it. Then, in the second step, he would invite a leading politician from the opposition Liberal Party to form a new government. Now, this new Liberal prime minister was in charge, but he faced a parliament still filled with his conservative enemies. This was not a problem. In the third step, the new prime minister would use his authority to dissolve parliament and call for new elections. And here, my ruler, is the cynical heart of the machine. The elections were not free and fair. They were controlled by the local landowning elites, the coronets, who used a combination of patronage, bribery, and intimidation to ensure the correct outcome. With the entire power of the state now behind them, the new liberal government would inevitably win a resounding victory. It was a wonderfully efficient way to hold an election if you already knew who was going to win. And so, the cycle was complete. The emperor's choice had become the people's choice. This strange, inverted system created a political life that was both stable and entirely artificial. It was a grand, elegant dance, choreographed by the emperor himself. The liberals would govern for a few years, then the emperor would give a signal, and the conservatives would be invited to lead the dance. It kept the elites happy, ensuring that no faction was ever truly cast into the wilderness. It was this system that allowed Brazil to avoid the endless cycle of coups and civil wars that plagued its republican neighbors. The last dying gasp of the old rebellious era came in 1848, with the Praia revolt in the province of Pernambuco. It was a liberal and radical uprising, a final echo of the Regency's chaos. But this time, the central government was strong and unified. The revolt was decisively crushed, signaling to all that the time for provincial challenges to Rio's authority was well and truly over. The emperor's system was now firmly in control. The peak of this stability came in the 1850s, during the era of conciliation. The emperor appointed a brilliant conservative, the Marquis of Paraná, to lead a cabinet that included men from both parties. For a time, the political rivalries were put aside in the name of national progress. It was a golden afternoon for the empire. Railroads were being planned, telegraph lines were being laid, and a sense of shared Brazilian identity, carefully nurtured by the paternalistic emperor, was taking root. And so, the scholar on the throne had succeeded. He had taken the violent, chaotic political world he had inherited and had tamed it, caging the storms of ambition within the elegant bars of his inverted parliamentary system. He was the calm center, the great moderator, the indispensable man who kept the entire machine in balance. But this machine, for all its stability, was designed to serve the interests of the few, and it was built upon a social order that was fundamentally unjust. The piece he had so carefully constructed was the piece of a magnificent house built over a sleeping volcano. The elegant political machine that Dom Pedro II had so carefully assembled, my ruler, brought a long and welcome peace to his empire. With the storms of rebellion and the fevers of factionalism finally tamed, Brazil entered a golden afternoon of stability. And in this newfound quiet, while the politicians in Rio played their predictable game of musical chairs, a different kind of power was growing in the countryside. A power rooted not in votes or ideology, but in the soil itself. A revolution was underway, a revolution driven by a small, bitter bean that would transform the face of Brazil forever. For centuries, the fortunes of Brazil had risen and fallen in cycles. There was the age of sugar, when the sweet cane of the Northeast had built colonial fortunes. Then came the age of gold, when the mines of Minas Gerais had glittered, only to eventually run dry. Now, a new king was ascending the economic throne, King Coffee. The rolling hills of the Paraíba Valley, a lush region stretching between the provinces of Rio de Janeiro and São Paulo, proved to have the perfect climate and the rich red earth needed to grow the coffee plant in unimaginable quantities. The world, it turned out, was developing a powerful thirst for this dark, energizing brew, and Brazil was perfectly positioned to quench it. Vast swaths of the Atlantic rainforest were cleared, the ancient trees felled and burned, to make way for a new kind of landscape, the fazenda. Imagine, if you will, looking out over a valley and seeing not a forest, but a sea. A green, geometric sea of coffee trees, planted in endless, orderly rows that marched over the hills and disappeared into the horizon. This was the engine of a new Brazil, a nation that would soon become the undisputed coffee capital of the world, producing more than half of the planet's supply. And with this new crop came a new class of kings. They were the Barões do Café, the coffee barons. These were men who, a generation before, might have been simple farmers. Now they were titans of industry, possessing a wealth so immense it beggared belief. They built opulent mansions, or casas grandes, in the middle of their plantations, grand European-style villas with ornate ballrooms and delicate porcelain, surrounded by a world of mud and manual labor. They became the new aristocracy of the empire. Emperor Pedro II, in a politically brilliant move, began granting them official titles of nobility. They became the Baron of this valley, the Viscount of that river. Their grand new names, a thin veneer of ancient tradition plastered over the raw new power of their wealth. These barons, in turn, became the staunchest supporters of the monarchy, a powerful pillar holding up the emperor's throne. But we must speak plainly, my ruler. For this entire glittering edifice, every ornate mansion, every bag of coffee exported to the cafes of Paris and London, every noble title bestowed by the emperor, rested on a foundation of profound and absolute evil. The coffee empire was built by and run for the benefit of one group of people, but it was built on the backs and with the blood of another. The engine of this great economic miracle was the institution of slavery. The life of an enslaved person on a coffee fazenda was a life of relentless, back-breaking toil. The day began before the sun rose, with the ringing of a bell that summoned them from the crowded, windowless slave quarters known as the senzalas. They would work until after the sun had set, clearing the forest, planting the seedlings, harvesting the ripe red coffee cherries by hand, and then processing them through the long, arduous night. The work was monotonous and exhausting, all done under the watchful eye of an overseer and the constant biting threat of the whip. Families were broken, traditions were erased, and human beings were treated as nothing more than pieces of agricultural machinery, their value measured only in the number of trees they could tend. It is a dark irony that the world's new favorite way to wake up and feel civilized was produced by one of the most brutal systems of human bondage ever devised. For decades, this system had been fed by a constant stream of human cargo from Africa. But by the middle of the century, the world was changing. Great Britain, the global superpower of the age, had made the abolition of the slave trade its great moral crusade, and its powerful navy prowled the Atlantic. Finally, in 1850, after years of immense British pressure that bordered on acts of war, the Brazilian government passed the Eusebio de Queiroz law, which at long last effectively ended the transatlantic slave trade. But this great humanitarian step had a horrific and unintended consequence. While the supply of new captives from Africa was cut off, the demand for labor on the booming coffee plantations only grew. The coffee barons needed more hands, and so they turned their eyes to other parts of Brazil. A massive, horrifying internal slave trade began. The owners of the declining sugar plantations in the Northeast, now in need of cash, began selling their enslaved people down the river to the coffee barons of the Southeast. It was a second Middle Passage, this time within Brazil itself. Families and communities that had endured for generations were torn apart, as tens of thousands of men, women, and children were marched overland or packed onto coastal ships for the journey south, sold from one form of brutal servitude to another. The immense wealth that this system produced did, it is true, begin to modernize the country. The coffee profits funded Brazil's first railroads, iron arteries built for the specific purpose of carrying the beans from the inland plantations to the coastal ports. It funded new banks, telegraph lines, and the beautification of Rio de Janeiro. But this progress was forever tainted by its source. It was progress for the few, paid for by the suffering of the many. And so, the empire entered its golden age, a picture of peace and prosperity. It was a nation whose politics were skillfully managed by a scholar on the throne, and whose coffers were filled by a bitter black bean. But this stability was a grand illusion, for the coffee barons were now the most powerful force in the land, and their power, their prestige, and their very identity were inextricably tied to the ownership of other human beings. This was the great fatal contradiction at the heart of Pedro II's Brazil, and it was a contradiction that would inevitably tear the empire apart. The Brazilian Empire, in the second half of the 19th century, presented a strange and deeply troubling paradox to the world. Here was a nation ruled by one of the most enlightened monarchs of the age, a scholar who corresponded with Victor Hugo and who dreamed of a modern scientific future for his people. And yet this progressive empire, as we have seen, was built upon a foundation so archaic, so brutal, that it belonged to another age entirely. The coffee that fueled its economy, the wealth that paid for its first railroads, the very stability the emperor had so carefully constructed, all depended on the ownership of human beings. This was the great contradiction, the moral sickness at the heart of the empire, and by the 1860s the rest of the world had noticed. A great tide of abolition had swept across the Atlantic world. The British Empire had abolished slavery decades before. The French had followed, Then, in 1865, the Great Civil War in the United States came to its bloody conclusion, and with it, slavery was ended in Brazil's most powerful neighbor. Suddenly, the Brazilian Empire found itself in a lonely and shameful position. Alongside the Spanish colonies of Cuba and Puerto Rico, it was one of the last nations in the Western world where one person could legally own another. For a monarch like Pedro II, who prided himself on being a man of progress, this was a source of profound personal and national humiliation. The emperor himself was a convinced abolitionist. He found the institution morally repugnant and privately worked to free the enslaved people he personally inherited. But as a constitutional monarch, he felt his hands were tied. You will recall the coffee barons, my ruler, that new and powerful aristocracy, whose fortunes were utterly dependent on the slave system. They were the bedrock of his political support. Pedro II lived in constant fear that if he pushed for abolition too quickly or too forcefully, these men would rise up against him, shattering the empire into a civil war far bloodier than the one seen in America. And so he trod a path of extreme caution. Was he a wise and pragmatic statesman, preventing a greater catastrophe? Or was he a timid leader, whose caution prolonged the suffering of millions? It is a question that historians still debate. But forces greater than the emperor's caution were at work. A homegrown abolitionist movement began to stir, gaining voice and courage. It was a movement fought on many fronts. In the halls of Parliament in Rio, eloquent politicians like Joaquim Nabuco began to deliver brilliant, passionate speeches, arguing that slavery was not just a moral crime, but a cancer on the nation's soul, holding it back from its modern destiny. In the literary salons and universities, poets like the great Castro Alves, the poet of the slaves, wrote verses of fire and pathos that captured the horror of the slave ships and the suffering of the plantations, awakening the conscience of a new generation. And most importantly, the enslaved people themselves continued their long, desperate struggle for freedom through acts of resistance, through escape to fugitive communities hidden in the forests, and through a quiet, daily defiance that constantly challenged the master's authority. By the end of the 1860s, the pressure had become immense. The emperor returned from a trip to Europe with a renewed determination that something, however small, must be done. He entrusted the task to his prime minister, the Viscount of Rio Branco, a staunch conservative. The goal was to create a law that would begin the process of abolition, but so slowly, so gradually, that it would not overly alarm the powerful slave-owning class. After months of ferocious debate, a bill was passed on the 28th of September, 1871. It was known as the Rio Branco Law, but it is better remembered by its far grander title, the Ley du Ventre Libre, the Law of the Free Womb. Its central provisions sounded momentous, a true turning point in the nation's history. It declared that from that day forward, every child born to an enslaved mother would be born legally free. A noble declaration indeed. But the genius of the law, from the perspective of the politicians who wrote it, was in the fine print, for the law contained a monumental catch. These legally free children, known as ingenuos, were not simply handed to their mothers. Instead, the law required them to remain in the custody of their mother's owner. When the child reached the age of 8, the owner had a choice. He could release the child to the state in return for a small cash payment, or he could choose to retain the child's labor until the age of 21 as a form of compensation. As you can imagine, nearly every owner chose the latter. So the law of the free womb was, in practice, a law that freed a newborn child only to condemn them to 21 years of unpaid servitude. It was a magnificent legal trick, a law that granted a future freedom to people who did not yet exist, payable in 2 decades. And yet, for the most hardline coffee barons, even this was too much. They howled in protest. They filled the newspapers with articles decrying this assault on their sacred right to property. They painted themselves as the victims, the ones being cruelly punished by a meddling government. To hear them tell it, the greatest injustice was not the person held in bondage, but the master whose right to exploit their children was being questioned. Despite its deep cynical flaws, the law of the free womb was a crack in the foundation of the slave empire. For the first time, the state had looked into the abyss of slavery and declared that it would, one day, have an end. It put the slave owners on notice that their world was not eternal. It transformed slavery from a permanent fact of nature into a problem with a deadline, however distant. And as a newborn child took its first breath in a senzala on a coffee plantation the day after the law was passed, a new and terrible reality dawned. That child was, in the eyes of the law, free. But in the eyes of the master, that child was still a possession, a source of labor for the next 21 years. The road to abolition had begun, but it would be a slow and bitter journey, and true freedom was still a lifetime away. The passage of the law of the free womb, which you will recall was the first, hesitant step on the long road to abolition, had left the political air in Rio thick with resentment. The emperor had spent months navigating the furious debates, caught between the slow-moving forces of progress and the immense unbending power of the coffee barons. Perhaps, my ruler, he felt the need for a change of scenery. For in 1871, shortly after the controversial law was signed, Dom Pedro II decided to do something utterly unprecedented for a reigning South American monarch. He packed his bags, left his daughter Isabel in charge as regent, and set off to see the world. This was not to be a royal tour in the grand European tradition. There was no flotilla of warships, no vast entourage of powdered aristocrats. The emperor traveled under the surprisingly modest alias of Pedro de Alcántara, presenting himself to the world not as a sovereign, but as a private citizen, a gentleman scholar on a quest for knowledge. He was accompanied by his quiet, devoted wife, the Empress Teresa Cristina, and a small, select group of companions. He was a monarch attempting to go incognito, a task made somewhat difficult by the fact that he was a 6'3", blue-eyed emperor with a famously magnificent beard. His choice of destinations was, for a monarch, deeply eccentric. While his European hosts dutifully prepared state banquets and military parades, they would often find that their imperial guest had a very different itinerary in mind. He wanted to visit factories and steel mills. He wanted to tour universities, libraries, and scientific laboratories. He was far more thrilled by a demonstration of a new steam engine or a tour of a modern sewage treatment plant than by any gala ball. One can only imagine the bewildered conversations among court officials across Europe, trying to entertain a king whose idea of a perfect day was a long and detailed conversation with a botanist. He traveled not to meet with kings and queens, but with the great minds of his age. In Paris, he walked into the home of the great writer Victor Hugo, unannounced, and the two men talked for hours. He visited the laboratory of Louis Pasteur and discussed the mysteries of microbiology. He met with the composer Richard Wagner. He was a collector, not of art or jewels, but of ideas and conversations, a monarch who truly believed that the greatest treasures a nation could possess were knowledge and innovation. His most famous journey came in 1876, when he traveled to the United States to attend the Grand Centennial Exposition in Philadelphia, a World's Fair celebrating the 100th anniversary of American independence. And it was here, in the noisy, crowded halls of the exposition, that the scholar emperor would have his most famous encounter with the future. Tucked away in a hot, obscure corner of the exhibition hall was a small, unassuming display by a young inventor named Alexander Graham Bell. He had created a strange new device he called the telephone, but on that day, no one was paying it much attention. The judges were tired and ready to leave. But the emperor had met Bell before, at a school for the deaf in Boston, and was intrigued by his work. He sought out the young inventor's booth, and Bell, thrilled to have a captive audience, offered him a demonstration. Pedro took the receiver and put it to his ear while Bell went to the transmitter at the other end of the hall. The emperor's eyes widened in sheer, unadulterated astonishment. The onlookers saw him gasp and exclaim in Portuguese, "Meu Deus, isto fala." My God, it talks. For good measure, he then recited a line from Hamlet into the device, as one does. This single dramatic endorsement from a respected emperor, in front of the press and the bewildered judges, turned the telephone from an ignored curiosity into the star of the entire exposition overnight. These travels, of course, served a double purpose. On the one hand, they were a genuine expression of Pedro's boundless intellectual curiosity. But on the other, they were a masterful, if subtle, exercise in international public relations. By touring the world as an enlightened man of science and letters, he was crafting a new image for Brazil. He was presenting his nation as a modern, stable, and civilized empire, a worthy partner for trade and investment, a country guided by a philosopher king. It was a very effective way to showcase the progress of Brazil and to gently distract the world's attention from the deeply embarrassing and uncivilized institution of slavery that was still the bedrock of his empire's economy. During his long absences, the government continued to function, and the empire remained stable under the regency of his quiet, intelligent, and deeply devout daughter, Princess Isabel. His trust in her was absolute, and by placing her in this position of power, he was preparing her for the throne and inadvertently setting the stage for the final, dramatic acts of the abolitionist struggle. When the emperor finally returned home from his travels, his bags were filled not with souvenirs, but with books, scientific instruments, and new ideas. He had seen the future. He had seen a world powered by steam and connected by telegraph wires. He had touched a telephone that could carry a human voice across a room. He had seen nations that were building their prosperity on industry, innovation, and free labor. And these experiences could only have thrown the great, backward contradiction of his own beloved Brazil into the sharpest possible relief. The more he learned of the modern world, the more he must have known that the institution his empire depended upon was a relic, a ghost from a darker age, and that its time was running out. The long, steady reign of Dom Pedro II had brought an unprecedented era of internal peace to the Brazilian Empire. The scholar on the throne, you will recall, detested violence and had carefully constructed a political system designed to prevent internal conflict. By the early 1860s, it seemed he had succeeded. The empire was stable, its economy was growing, and its future seemed to be one of quiet, ordered progress. But peace, my ruler, is often a local affair. And while all was calm within the heart of the empire, a storm of immense and terrible power was gathering on its southwestern frontier, in the tangled, swampy heart of the continent. The region known as the Rio de la Plata Basin, where the borders of Brazil, Argentina, Paraguay, and Uruguay all converged, had always been a powder keg. It was a land of shifting alliances and deep-seated rivalries, a place where the old imperial struggles between Spain and Portugal continued to echo in the ambitions of their successor states. Brazil was the regional giant, the stable empire looking to secure its borders and project its power. Argentina, its great rival, was a sprawling and often chaotic republic, also seeking to establish itself as the dominant force. And between them lay two smaller nations, Uruguay, a perpetually unstable buffer state, and Paraguay. Paraguay was a unique case. It was a landlocked, isolated nation, but for decades it had been ruled by a succession of authoritarian leaders who had poured all the state's resources into a single project: building an army. By the 1860s, the Paraguayan military was, on paper, the most formidable in South America. It was large, well-trained, and fiercely disciplined, and at its head was a new leader, a man named Francisco Solano Lopez. Lopez was the son of the previous dictator, educated in Europe, and possessed of a boundless ambition that far outstripped his nation's resources. He saw himself as a new Napoleon, a man destined to break Paraguay's isolation, forge a regional empire, and make himself the arbiter of the continent's destiny. He looked upon his powerful neighbors not with fear, but with a dangerous, simmering contempt. The spark that would ignite the powder keg came, as it so often did, from the chaotic politics of Uruguay. The small nation was, as usual, embroiled in a bitter civil war between its two main political parties, the Blancos and the Colorados. Solano Lopez and his government in Paraguay backed the ruling Blancos. Brazil, for its part, had long-standing ties to the opposition Colorados. When the conflict escalated, Brazil did what it had done before. It decided to intervene militarily to protect its interests and support its allies. In 1864, the Brazilian Navy sailed into Uruguayan waters, and Brazilian troops crossed the border. From his capital of Asunción, Solano Lopez watched this with fury. He saw Brazil's intervention as a direct threat to his Uruguayan allies, and more importantly, a grave insult to his own rising prestige. He could not allow Brazil to simply rearrange the board without consulting him, the new great power, and so he made a fateful and catastrophic miscalculation. He sent an ultimatum to the Brazilian Empire, demanding that it withdraw from Uruguay. The court in Rio de Janeiro, seeing itself as the continent's preeminent power, was stunned by the sheer audacity of this demand. They ignored it. Lopez, his pride wounded and his grand ambitions challenged, decided to act. In November of 1864, he ordered his forces to seize a Brazilian civilian steamship as it sailed up the Paraguay River. A few weeks later, he launched a surprise invasion of the vast, sparsely populated Brazilian province of Mato Grosso. The war had begun, but Lopez was not finished. To effectively fight the Brazilians in Uruguay, he needed to move his main army south. The most direct route lay across a sliver of Argentine territory. He demanded permission from the Argentine president to cross. Argentina, officially neutral in the conflict, refused. And so, in early 1865, Solano Lopez, in a breathtaking act of strategic recklessness, declared war on Argentina as well, and sent his army marching across its border. In the space of just a few months, he had managed to start a war with the two largest nations in South America simultaneously. This second invasion had a predictable effect. In May of 1865, Brazil, Argentina, and the new Colorado government of Uruguay, which had been installed in power thanks to Brazil's help, signed the Treaty of the Triple Alliance. The three nations bound themselves together in a military pact with a single stated goal: to overthrow the government of Francisco Solano Lopez and ensure Paraguay could never again threaten the peace of the region. The Allies were supremely confident. Their combined populations and resources dwarfed those of tiny Paraguay. The Brazilian foreign minister famously declared that the war would be over in a matter of months, a brisk military parade to Asunción. It was a prediction that would become a dark, running joke for the next 5 years. The true causes of this devastating war are still debated. For a long time it was portrayed simply as a struggle against the megalomania of a single evil dictator. Later, some would argue it was a cynical plot by Brazil and Argentina, backed by British financiers, to destroy a prosperous and independent Paraguay. The truth, as is so often the case, is more complex. It was a war born of long-standing regional rivalries, of border disputes and struggles for influence. But there can be no doubt that the match that finally lit the fuse was the proud, reckless, and catastrophic ambition of Francisco Solano Lopez. And so, as 1865 began, the armies were on the move. The Brazilian people were fired with patriotic outrage, volunteering in droves to defend the honor of the empire. The Argentines were ready to repel the invaders, and Solano Lopez, surrounded by enemies, was certain that his disciplined legions would triumph and secure his place in the pantheon of heroes. No one, on any side, was prepared for the war they were about to fight. It was meant to be a short, glorious adventure. It would become a 5-year descent into a nightmare of mud, disease, and industrialized slaughter unlike anything the continent had ever seen. The great armies of the Triple Alliance marched to war in 1865 with a song in their hearts and a confident swagger in their step. You will recall, my ruler, their bold prediction: a swift victory in 3 months. They were marching against a single small landlocked nation led by a man they saw as a preposterous tyrant. They were the giants of the continent, come to swat a fly. They were about to learn that this fly had a bite of iron, and that the delusions of one man, when imposed upon an entire nation, can create a ferocity that defies all military logic. The initial Paraguayan offensives, which had seemed so bold, quickly stalled. An army sent south into Argentina was surrounded and forced to surrender. The invasion of Mato Grosso bogged down. And then, in June of 1865, came the first great turning point of the war. It took place not on land, but on the wide, muddy waters of the Paraná River, in a naval clash known as the Battle of Riachuelo. It was here that the Brazilian Imperial Navy met the Paraguayan fleet. It was, to be frank, not a fair fight. Brazil had modern, steam-powered, ironclad warships. Paraguay had a collection of converted wooden steamers and armed barges. It was a battle between the industrial age and the age of wood, and the outcome was as brutal as it was predictable. The Paraguayan navy was annihilated. This victory was more than just a single battle won. It was the strategic key to the entire war. With control of the great rivers, the Allies could now enforce a crushing blockade. Paraguay was completely cut off from the outside world, unable to import new weapons, ammunition, or supplies. Solano Lopez and his nation were now trapped in their own heartland. The war of invasion was over. A war of annihilation was about to begin. The Allied forces began a slow, agonizing advance into Paraguayan territory. They expected the enemy to collapse. Instead, they ran into a wall. This wall was a massive defensive system known as the Quadrilateral, a network of trenches, forts, and hidden river batteries centered on the seemingly impregnable fortress of Humaitá. It was a masterpiece of defensive engineering, perfectly situated amidst treacherous swamps and winding rivers. The war of swift marches was over. It now became a brutal, grinding siege. For the next 3 years, the Allied armies would be bogged down here in a living hell of trench warfare that was a grim preview of what Europe would experience 50 years later. The soldiers on both sides lived and died in a nightmare landscape. The heat was suffocating, the humidity absolute, the air thick with swarms of mosquitoes. The trenches were filled with mud and disease. Cholera swept through the camps, killing far more men than bullets ever could. The Brazilians, Argentines, and Uruguayans, who had come for a quick victory, found themselves locked in a miserable war of attrition, fighting for inches of swampy ground against an enemy who simply would not break. And this, my ruler, is the great dark question of the war. Why? Why did the Paraguayans fight with such fanatical, suicidal bravery long after all hope of victory was gone? The answer lies in the nation that Lopez and his father had built, and the absolute tyranny with which he waged his war. For decades, Paraguay had been isolated from the world, a policy that had forged a powerful and unique sense of national identity. Lopez harnessed this. He controlled every piece of information that entered the country, portraying the war as a genocidal crusade by the Allies to exterminate the Paraguayan race. To the common Paraguayan soldier, surrender was not an option. They were told it meant certain torture and death. They were fighting, they believed, for the very existence of their people. But patriotism was not the only tool Lopez used. His other great weapon was fear. As the war turned against him, he descended into a spiral of violent paranoia. He created a secret police force that permeated every level of society. He began to see traitors everywhere. He had his own minister of foreign affairs executed. He had the Bishop of Asunción tortured and killed. He even had his own 2 brothers and a brother-in-law arrested, tortured, and shot on suspicion of plotting against him. High-ranking generals who failed in battle were not demoted. They were summarily executed. For many in Paraguay, the safest place to be was on the front line, facing the enemy, because the terror behind them, in their own capital, was just as deadly. This combination of fierce patriotism and absolute terror transformed the Paraguayan nation into a weapon. Lopez's strategy was one of total, scorched-earth resistance. He conscripted every able-bodied man. As the war chewed through his army, the criteria for able-bodied became ever wider. Old men were sent to the front, and then, most tragically, boys, some as young as 12, were given uniforms, armed with lances and ancient muskets, and thrown into the meat grinder. The entire nation was being systematically sacrificed to feed the grand delusions of its leader, who could not, and would not, ever admit defeat. So the Allied soldiers sat in their swampy trenches, staring at the walls of Humaitá. The 3-month parade to Asunción was now in its 3rd year. They were not fighting a normal army. They were fighting a whole society that had been turned into a death cult. They would eventually break through. They would take Humaitá and, in time, the capital itself. But the cost of extinguishing Francisco Solano Lopez's ambition would be the near-total destruction of the nation he had led into the abyss. And for the Brazilian Empire, this long, bloody education in the horrors of modern warfare would change its army, its politics, and its very soul forever. For 3 long years, my ruler, the Allied armies, had been trapped in the malarial swamps of Paraguay, their advance halted by the great fortress of Humita. The 3-month war, which you will recall was their confident prediction, had descended into a seemingly endless nightmare of disease and trench warfare. Back in Brazil, the initial patriotic fervor had long since curdled into a deep and weary frustration. The war was costing a fortune in blood and treasure, and there was no end in sight. But finally, in the summer of 1868, after a series of daring naval maneuvers and bloody frontal assaults, the great fortress and its surrounding defenses finally fell. The wall was broken. The road to the Paraguayan capital, Asunción, was open. In January of 1869, the Brazilian army, led by the veteran commander the Duke of Caxias, marched into the city. They expected a final climactic battle, a glorious capture of the enemy's heart. Instead, they found an eerie, hollow victory. The city had been largely evacuated, and their ultimate prize, the dictator Francisco Solano Lopez, was gone. He had taken what remained of his government and his dwindling followers and had simply vanished into the rugged, mountainous interior of the country. The Allies had captured the capital, but the man who was the living embodiment of the war had escaped them. The victory parade in the sacked, empty streets of Asunción must have felt deeply anticlimactic. And so, the final tragic phase of the war began. It was no longer a war between nations, it was a manhunt. The Duke of Caxias, believing the conflict was essentially over, resigned his command. To finish the job, the emperor sent his own son-in-law, the French Prince Gaston d'Orléans, the Count of Eu, who was married to Princess Isabel. The Count's task was simple and brutal: find Lopez and end this war, once and for all. For more than a year, the Brazilian army pursued the Paraguayan dictator across his ruined country. It was a grim chase through a land populated by widows, orphans, and ghosts. Finally, on the 1st of March, 1870, at a remote spot near the northern border called Cherocorá, the chase came to an end. The last remnants of the Paraguayan army, a pathetic force of a few hundred ragged men, many of them old men and children, were cornered. Solano Lopez, wounded but defiant, refused to surrender. He was struck down by a Brazilian soldier while fighting near a stream. His last recorded words, uttered as he died, became a national motto: "Muero con mi patria." "I die with my country!" He was tragically correct. He had taken his country into the abyss with him. The war was over. For Paraguay, the cost was a demographic catastrophe almost without parallel in modern history. While the exact numbers will forever be debated, it is estimated that the nation lost well over half of its entire population. The devastation of the adult male population was even more extreme, with some estimates claiming that as many as 90% had perished. It was a nation of women, children, and ghosts, a ruin that would take generations to recover. For Brazil, the victor, the accounting was also grim. It was a classic Pyrrhic victory, a triumph so costly it felt like a defeat. The financial cost was staggering, a mountain of debt that would cripple the imperial budget for decades to come. But the human cost was even more profound. At least 50,000 Brazilian soldiers had died, the vast majority not from combat, but from the rampant diseases that had swept through the camps. Thousands more returned home maimed, crippled, or psychologically scarred by the horrors they had witnessed. Brazil had won, yes, but it had won so hard it had nearly broken itself. Yet the most significant and lasting consequence of the war was not measured in debt or in graves. It was the transformation of the Brazilian army itself. The army that had marched off to war in 1864 was a small, poorly equipped, and politically neglected institution. The war forced it to change. To defeat the fanatical Paraguayans, the army had to modernize, to professionalize, to grow into a large and effective fighting force. The men who returned in 1870 were not the same men who had left. They were hardened veterans of a long and brutal conflict. They had a shared identity, forged in the swamps of Humaitá, and a powerful new sense of their own importance. They returned as the saviors of the nation, but they felt that the civilian politicians in Rio, whom they derisively called casacas or frock coats, did not give them the respect or the pay that they deserved. And they brought back more than just grievances. They brought back dangerous new ideas. Many of these soldiers and officers had fought side by side with enslaved men who had been granted their freedom in exchange for military service. They had seen these men fight and die with courage for the empire. This experience planted powerful abolitionist seeds within the military. Furthermore, having seen the chaos and inefficiency of the monarchy at war, some officers began to whisper that perhaps a republic, a more modern form of government, was the true path to national strength. And so, as the victorious Brazilian soldiers paraded through the streets of Rio de Janeiro to the cheers of a relieved population, the emperor and his ministers might have felt a shiver of unease. They had successfully prosecuted and won the largest war in South America's history. But in doing so, they had accidentally created a new and powerful force within their own borders. This new army, proud, professional, and now politically conscious, would not be content to simply fade back into the background. It had saved the empire, and it now believed it had a right to say how the empire should be run. It was a force that would, in time, prove far more dangerous to the throne than any foreign dictator. As we have spoken of, my ruler, the Brazilian Empire took its first, hesitant step against slavery with the Law of the Free Womb in 1871. It was a law that sounded grand in its title, but in practice, it was a masterpiece of delay. A decade passed, and while a new generation of children was being born with the legal status of free, they were still living a life of forced servitude on the coffee plantations. The institution of slavery, for the nearly 1.5 million people still held in bondage, remained a brutal, daily reality. The failure of that law to bring about any meaningful change gave birth to a new kind of abolitionism, a movement that was no longer willing to be patient, no longer content with polite debate in Parliament. The fight for freedom was about to move into the streets. The 1880s saw the rise of a new generation of fiery, brilliant, and uncompromising abolitionist leaders. In the press, the journalist José de Patrocinio, himself the son of a vicar and an enslaved woman, wrote articles of such passion and fury that they electrified the nation. In the courts, a lawyer named Luis Gama, a man who had been born into slavery and had taught himself to read, used his legal genius to find loopholes and technicalities in the law that allowed him to legally free hundreds of enslaved people. And in the salons and public squares, statesmen like Joaquim Nabuco argued that slavery was not just a crime, but a national curse that poisoned every aspect of Brazilian society and made a mockery of its civilized aspirations. But the movement was no longer just one of speeches and articles. It was becoming a popular crusade, a movement of direct action. And one of its greatest heroes was not a politician or a writer, but a humble fisherman from the northeastern province of Ceará. His name was Francisco José do Nascimento, but he would become known to history by his nickname, Dragão do Mar, the Dragon of the Sea. His port was a major hub for the cruel internal slave trade, where people were loaded onto ships to be sent south to the coffee plantations. In 1881, the Dragon of the Sea and his fellow raft fishermen, the Jangadeiros, took a stand. They declared a strike, refusing to transport any more human cargo from the shore to the waiting ships. Their simple, courageous act of defiance effectively shut down the slave trade in their state and was a thunderclap that echoed across the empire. It was proof that the power to end slavery did not just lie with the emperor or the parliament, but with ordinary people. Inspired by acts like this, the movement became more organized and more daring. Abolitionist societies in the cities began to establish what amounted to a Brazilian underground railroad. They organized and funded mass escapes from the coffee plantations of the southeast. Activists would sneak onto the fazendas at night, guiding people to freedom, passing them along a network of safe houses until they could reach a safe haven, like the province of Ceará, which in 1884, 4 years before the rest of the nation, officially abolished slavery within its own borders. The slave system was beginning to collapse, not from the top down, but from the bottom up. The government in Rio and the coffee barons watched this with growing panic. They were losing control. In a desperate attempt to seize back the initiative, to show that they were the ones managing the end of slavery, they decided to pass another gradual reform law. They needed a bill that would create the appearance of progress, while doing as little actual damage to the slave economy as possible. The result was the Saraiva Cotegipe Law of 1885, better known as the Ley dos Sexagenarios, the Sexagenarians' Law. The law declared that all enslaved people over the age of 60 were now free. This, my ruler, was a law of almost comical cruelty. In the brutal conditions of the plantations, very few enslaved people even lived to see their 60th birthday. For those who did, their years of productive labor were already behind them. But the cruelty did not end there. The law also stipulated that these newly freed elders were required to work for 3 more years for their former owner as a form of indemnity. It was, in effect, a state-sponsored retirement plan where you were freed near the end of your life, but only after working for 3 more years without pay. The reaction to the law was universal contempt. The abolitionists saw it for the cynical sham that it was. The enslaved population, of course, gained almost nothing, and even the most hardline slave owners, in a spectacular display of self-pity, hated it, seeing it as another government intrusion upon their property rights, even if the property in question was already worn out. This deeply flawed law was a fatal error for the slave-owning class. It exposed them as morally bankrupt, unwilling to make even the most minuscule of concessions, and it revealed the government that protected them to be weak and ineffectual. The attempt to pass such a meaningless law only served to galvanize the public and radicalize the abolitionist movement. The final pillars supporting the institution of slavery were now beginning to crumble. The army, its ranks filled with veterans of the Paraguayan War who were sympathetic to the abolitionist cause, began to signal that it would no longer act as slave catchers for the planters. The ground was shifting under the feet of the coffee barons. Imagine, my ruler, an enslaved man, perhaps 61 years old, waking up on his 61st birthday in 1886. The law says he is free, but he must report to the same fields, work for the same master, and live in the same senzala, with the promise of true freedom dangling just out of reach, 3 years in the future. The government had tried to let the air out of the abolitionist balloon slowly and carefully, but with this insulting, cruel law, they had only pumped it fuller, stretching it to the bursting point. The end of slavery was no longer a distant prospect. It was an imminent certainty. The only question left was how and when the final break would come. The laws of men, my ruler, are often like dams built to contain the great river of history. They may hold for a time, but when the pressure becomes too great, the water will find a way through. By the year 1887, the dam that was Brazilian slavery was not just cracking, it was collapsing. The cynical and insulting sexagenarians' law, which we spoke of last, had been the final straw. The abolitionist movement, now a vast and popular crusade, had abandoned all hope in gradual reform. Mass escapes from the coffee plantations became an epidemic. The enslaved were freeing themselves, voting with their feet, creating a tide of humanity that the state could no longer control. The system was rotting from the inside out. And at this moment of supreme national crisis, the emperor was absent. Dom Pedro II, now an old and weary man, his health failing, had sailed for Europe for what would be his final trip, seeking medical treatment for his ailments. He left the empire, as he had done before, in the steady hands of his daughter and heir, the Princess Regent Isabel. Isabel was not her father. Where Pedro was a cautious intellectual, a man who saw every side of an issue and always feared that a sudden move would shatter the nation's fragile peace, Isabel was a woman of quiet, unshakable conviction. She was deeply religious, and her Catholic faith informed her belief that slavery was a profound and mortal sin against God. She had been the regent who had signed the law of the free womb 17 years earlier, and she had watched with growing impatience as that law failed to deliver true freedom. Influenced by close abolitionist friends like the brilliant black engineer André Rebouças, she was not inclined to let this historical moment slip away in another round of cautious debate. The situation she inherited as regent was one of controlled chaos. The coffee barons were watching their workforce literally walk away. The army, that powerful new force in Brazilian politics, had publicly signaled that its soldiers would no longer perform the degrading task of hunting down fugitives. Public opinion, at least in the cities, was overwhelmingly in favor of immediate abolition. Brazil was at a tipping point. Slavery would end. The only question was whether it would end with the stroke of a pen or in the fire of a full-scale social revolution. Isabel chose the pen. Seeing that the time for compromise was long past, she acted with a decisiveness her father had always shied away from. She used her authority as regent to dismiss the conservative cabinet and appoint a new prime minister, João Alfredo, a man she knew was ready to take the final step. She gave him a single historic mission: to draft and pass the law that would eradicate slavery from Brazilian soil, immediately and without conditions. In May of 1888, the bill was introduced into the General Assembly in Rio. The last defenders of slavery, the most recalcitrant of the coffee barons, stood to make their final, desperate arguments about property rights and economic ruin. But they were voices from a dying world, shouting against a hurricane of change. The debate was swift. The bill passed the Chamber of Deputies, and then the Senate with massive, overwhelming support. The dam was about to burst. The 13th of May, 1888, was a golden, sunny Sunday in Rio de Janeiro. A massive, expectant crowd, a sea of black and white and brown faces, had gathered outside the imperial palace, waiting for history to be made. Inside, Princess Isabel, flanked by her ministers, took up a special golden pen that had been crafted for the occasion. Before her lay the law, a document of breathtaking brevity and monumental consequence, and she signed it. The law was given a name as beautiful as its purpose: the Lei Aurea, the Golden Law. It was perhaps the shortest major law ever written. Article 1. From this date forward, slavery is declared abolished in Brazil. Article 2. All dispositions to the contrary are revoked. That was it. With 18 simple words, 350 years of brutal human bondage was brought to an end. It was, one might say, a remarkably short and simple answer to a very long and complicated problem. The moment the signing was announced, the city of Rio, and soon the entire nation, erupted in a joyous delirium. Church bells pealed, cannons fired salutes. The crowds in the streets sang and danced and wept. The celebration lasted for days, a carnival of liberation. Princess Isabel was hailed as a saint, a savior, a redentora, the redemptress. She had cleansed the nation of its original sin. But in this moment of moral triumph, two crucial things were omitted from the Golden Law. First, it offered absolutely no financial compensation to the slave owners for the loss of what they considered their property. These men, who had stubbornly refused every gentle compromise for decades, now faced what they saw as total financial ruin. They had won every battle against reform, only to lose the war in the most absolute way possible. They would never forgive the monarchy. Second, and more tragically, the law offered nothing to the nearly 700,000 newly freed people. No land, no money, no education, no support of any kind. They were granted freedom and then promptly abandoned, cast into a deeply prejudiced society with nothing but the clothes on their backs. But on that sunny afternoon, these concerns were for the future. For now, there was only the pure, radiant joy of liberation. As Princess Isabel stood on the palace balcony, waving to the adoring crowds, she was at the absolute peak of her popularity. She had just enacted the single most important and morally courageous act in the long history of the Brazilian monarchy. She had freed the last slaves in the Western Hemisphere. And in doing so, my ruler, she had just signed the death warrant for her father's throne. The great and noble act of abolition, which we have just witnessed, was the moment the Brazilian monarchy chose its conscience over its own survival. By signing the Golden Law, Princess Isabel, acting for her father, knowingly shattered the first and most powerful pillar supporting the throne, the loyalty of the slave-owning class. But an empire, my ruler, does not collapse from a single blow. Its fall is often a story of decay, of the slow cracking of all its foundations. And to understand the monarchy's final lonely isolation, we must turn the clock back a little, to the 1870s, to witness how the emperor himself stumbled into a needless and damaging conflict that would crack the second great pillar of his support, the Catholic Church. For most of its history, the relationship between the Brazilian state and the Catholic Church had been one of comfortable, if complex, partnership. This relationship was governed by an old system inherited from Portugal called the padroado, or patronage. Under this system, the church in Brazil was not an independent power. It was in many ways a branch of the state. The emperor paid the salaries of the priests and bishops from the public treasury. He had the right to approve all clerical appointments, and most importantly, no order or decree from the Pope in Rome, a papal bull, could have any legal force in Brazil until it had received the emperor's formal approval, the Beneplácito Imperial. The emperor, in effect, was the practical head of the church within his own domains. For decades, this system worked well enough. But in the mid-19th century, a powerful new wind was blowing from Rome. The Vatican, under Pope Pius IX, was engaged in a great struggle against the forces of liberalism and secularism. This movement, known as Ultramontanism, sought to reassert the Pope's absolute authority over the global church, demanding that the loyalty of all Catholics be to Rome first, above any king or emperor. This new, uncompromising spirit soon collided with the comfortable, relaxed traditions of Brazil. In 1864, the Pope issued a document that, among many other things, condemned secret societies, most notably the Freemasons, and forbade any Catholic from being a member. This created an immediate and profoundly awkward situation in Brazil. Unlike in Europe, where Freemasonry was often seen as anti-clerical, in Brazil it was a popular and prestigious fraternal order for the educated elite, and, as it happened, many of the most powerful men in Dom Pedro's government, including his own prime minister, the Viscount of Rio Branco, were high-ranking Freemasons. The emperor was now faced with a rather delicate choice: anger the Pope in Rome, or excommunicate his own cabinet. Dom Pedro II, the scholar and man of science, had little patience for what he saw as theological squabbles. He calmly exercised his beneplácito and refused to grant the papal bull the force of law in Brazil. The crisis he hoped was averted, but the Pope's call for obedience had been heard. Two new, young, and zealous bishops, Dom Vital in the province of Olinda and Dom Macedo in Belém, were passionate believers in the new ultramontane doctrine. They believed their ultimate duty was to God and his vicar in Rome, not to a secular emperor in Rio de Janeiro. In direct defiance of the emperor's order, they began to enforce the papal bull, demanding that any Catholic brotherhoods in their dioceses expel their Freemason members. The government saw this not as an act of faith, but as an act of open insurrection. These bishops were not merely private citizens. They were officials of the state, their salaries paid by the treasury, and they were openly defying the laws of the empire they had sworn to uphold. The prime minister ordered them to cease. The bishops, citing the superiority of divine law over human law, refused. The standoff escalated until the matter landed before the Supreme Court of the empire. What followed was a political catastrophe. The bishops were arrested, put on trial for defying the state, and in 1874, to the absolute horror of the nation's devout, they were found guilty. They were sentenced to 4 years of hard labor. The government had won. Legally, the emperor's authority was supreme, but in the court of public opinion he had just suffered a devastating blow. The image of two princes of the church in their sacred vestments being led away to a common prison was a scandal of the highest order. It turned the bishops into martyrs for the faith and cast the emperor, the great moderate, as a godless tyrant. It was a victory that cost him far more than any defeat. The backlash from the clergy and the faithful was immense. The church, which had always been a quiet, reliable supporter of the throne, now saw the monarchy as an enemy. Dom Pedro, realizing the immense damage he had done, tried to de-escalate. A year later, in 1875, he granted the bishops a full pardon, and they were released. But the gesture did little to heal the wound. The pardon was seen not as an act of grace, but as a sign of weakness, an admission that the government had overreached. And so, a deep and bitter resentment took root. The intimate alliance between the throne and the altar, which had lasted for centuries, was broken. The second great pillar of the monarchy was now badly cracked. It had not been shattered by a grand moral debate like abolition, but by a stubborn and, in hindsight, unnecessary conflict over the finer points of law and religious authority. The emperor, in trying to assert his power, had only succeeded in alienating one of his oldest and most important allies. The crown was becoming ever more isolated, resting on ever more fragile ground. We have seen, my ruler, how the great pillars that held up the Brazilian monarchy were cracked, one by one. The slave-owning class, the great economic foundation of the empire, was shattered by the Golden Law. The Catholic Church, the spiritual foundation, was alienated by the emperor's quarrel with his own bishops. And so, by the late 1880s, the throne of Dom Pedro II rested on one final and dangerously unstable pillar of support, the military. But this was not the small, loyal army of his youth. This was the new army, the one forged in the fires of the Paraguayan War, and it was an institution that was beginning to feel it no longer needed an emperor. You will recall that the army that returned from Paraguay was proud, professional, and deeply conscious of its own importance. They saw themselves as the saviors of the nation, the only institution that had truly bled for the empire. Yet when they returned home, they were met not with gratitude, but with what they saw as neglect. Their pay was low, their promotions were slow, and they felt a deep and abiding contempt for the civilian politicians in Rio, the men in their fancy frock coats, the casacas, who, they believed, had mismanaged the war from the safety of their offices and now refused the army the respect it had earned. Into this fertile ground of resentment, a new and powerful ideology took root. It was a philosophy born in France called positivism. It was a complex and, to be frank, rather dry system of thought, but it captivated the young officers in Brazil's military academies. Positivism was, in essence, a religion of science. It rejected all theology and metaphysics, and it especially disliked the outdated institution of monarchy. It preached that society should be governed by a scientific, technically proficient elite, who would impose order to achieve progress. Its official motto was order and progress. It was, one might say, the perfect philosophy for a group of young, ambitious military men who were already convinced they were smarter and more capable than the politicians they served. This new ideology gave the army's simmering discontent a moral and intellectual justification. They were not just disgruntled employees of the state. They were the vanguard of the future, the men destined to bring true modernity to Brazil. The chief apostle of this new creed was a professor at the military academy named Benjamin Constant, who taught a whole generation of officers to see the monarchy as an obstacle to the nation's destiny. This clash between the army's newfound pride and the authority of the civilian government erupted in a series of public conflicts in the mid-1880s that came to be known as the Questão Militar, the military question. It began, as these things often do, with a seemingly minor incident. An army officer published an article in a newspaper criticizing a proposal about military pensions. The Minister of War, citing regulations that forbade officers from making public political statements without permission, ordered the officer to be disciplined. What should have been a simple matter of military protocol instead exploded into a national crisis. The army's leadership, led by the country's most revered war hero, the aging and famously grumpy Marshal Deodoro da Fonseca, rose up in defense of the junior officer. This was not about pensions, they declared. It was a matter of the army's honor, which had been insulted by a civilian politician. Marshal Deodoro, a man who was personally loyal to the emperor but fiercely protective of his beloved army, became the reluctant public face of the military's insubordination. Faced with the open defiance of its most powerful generals, the civilian government did what it had been doing for years. It backed down. The Minister of War resigned, and the officer was let off. This was a fatal mistake. The army had challenged the government, and the government had blinked. They learned a crucial lesson. The monarchy was weak, and the politicians were terrified of them. This pattern repeated itself in other disputes, and with each victory, the army grew bolder and more convinced of its own power. Adding to their prestige, the army took a very public and popular moral stand on the great issue of the day. As we have seen, the military leadership declared that it would no longer allow its soldiers to be used as slave catchers, refusing to hunt down the people escaping from the plantations. This aligned them with the triumphant abolitionist movement and cast them as a progressive, modernizing force, the true conscience of the nation, in stark contrast to the politicians who were often seen as backward slave owners. Through this series of confrontations, the final pillar of the monarchy was irrevocably cracked. Dom Pedro II was caught in the middle. He tried to act as a neutral arbiter, but he ended up satisfying no one. The army felt he had not adequately defended its honor, and the politicians felt he had not adequately supported their authority. The deep, personal bond of loyalty that had once tied the military to its emperor was gone. The army no longer saw itself as the defender of the throne. It now saw the throne as the primary obstacle to the glorious, orderly, and progressive republic it felt destined to create. And so, as 1888 came to a close, just months after the Golden Law was signed, the empire was left utterly alone. The coffee barons, its economic pillar, were furious and vengeful. The church, its spiritual pillar, was alienated and distrustful. And now the army, its final pillar of physical force, was openly insubordinate, armed with a new republican ideology, and convinced of its own destiny to rule. The emperor, old and ill, was a man respected for his past, but increasingly seen as irrelevant to the future. The monarchy, once a mighty tree, was now hollowed out from within, waiting for a final, gentle push to send it toppling over. The great bells that celebrated the Golden Law in May of 1888 rang out a message of liberation across Brazil. In the streets of Rio de Janeiro, a carnival of freedom erupted, and Princess Isabel was hailed as the Redemptress, a saint who had washed away the nation's original sin. But in the quiet, cavernous great houses of the coffee plantations, the Casas Grandes of the Paraíba Valley, the sound was not one of celebration. It was the sound of a cold, calculating, and unforgiving rage. The monarchy had just made its most powerful moral statement, and in doing so, it had made a mortal enemy of the very men who had once been its greatest strength. You will recall, my ruler, the coffee barons. For more than half a century, they had been the true power behind the throne. Their wealth had funded the empire, their political parties had run the government, and their loyalty had been the bedrock of Dom Pedro's long and stable reign. In return, the monarchy had protected their interests and their most valuable asset, their legal right to own other human beings. Now, with a single stroke of a golden pen, the Princess Regent had declared their property, worth billions in today's money, to be utterly worthless, and she had done so without offering a single cent in compensation. In the eyes of the coffee barons, this was not justice. It was grand larceny, a profound and unforgivable betrayal. The political consequences were immediate and catastrophic for the crown. The Republican movement in Brazil had, for most of its existence, been a tiny idealistic fringe, a bookish club for a few urban intellectuals who dreamed of a different future. It had no money, no popular support, and no real power. But on the 14th of May, 1888, the day after the Golden Law was signed, the Republican Party suddenly received a massive influx of new members. They came to be known as the Republicans of May 14th. These were the planters, the barons, the viscounts, men who had been fervent lifelong monarchists on May 12th, but who awoke on May 14th with a sudden miraculous conversion to the ideals of Republican government. Their newfound love for liberty, it must be said, was directly proportional to the size of the fortune they had just lost. And what of the nearly 700,000 people at the center of this historic act? For them, the joy of liberation was soon tempered by a harsh new reality. The Golden Law had broken their chains, but it had left them utterly abandoned. They were pushed off the plantations with no land, no homes, no education, and no money. Freedom, they discovered, did not mean equality. Many were forced into a new kind of bondage, working as destitute sharecroppers for their former masters, while tens of thousands migrated to the cities in search of work. There, they were met with prejudice and a labor market that now preferred a new solution to Brazil's labor problem: mass immigration from Europe. This tragic policy, which sought to whiten the population while marginalizing the very people who had built the nation's wealth, led to the creation of the first sprawling shanty towns, the favelas, on the hillsides of Rio. In August of 1888, a few months after the Golden Law was signed, the Emperor Dom Pedro II returned from his medical treatment in Europe. He was greeted with the largest, most sincere outpouring of public affection of his entire 50-year reign. The common people, and especially the newly freed Afro-Brazilians, adored him and his daughter. They saw the monarchy as their great benefactor. On the surface, the throne had never been more popular. But this popularity was a beautiful, tragic illusion. For while the emperor was loved by the powerless masses, he was now despised by the powerful elites. The great secret of the Brazilian Empire was that it had never been a democracy. It was an oligarchy managed by an emperor. And now, the most important oligarchs wanted him gone. The Republican movement was not a popular uprising. It was an elite conspiracy, a convergence of resentful money and ambitious muscle. The two essential ingredients for a successful coup were now in place. The coffee barons, the Republicans of May 14th, brought the money, the political influence, and the burning desire for revenge against the crown that had betrayed them. And the other great discontented power in the empire, the army, provided the second ingredient. As we have seen, the military was already steeped in Republican, positivist ideology, and it felt a deep contempt for the civilian politicians of the monarchy. Now, the wealthy planters who had once despised the army's radical ideas began to see the military as a useful, even necessary tool to achieve their goals. The two most powerful groups in Brazil, for entirely different reasons, now had a common enemy. And so we have the final tragic portrait of the empire in its last year. The emperor, old, ill, and increasingly detached from the political world, waves to adoring crowds, a beloved symbol of a system that is already hollowed out. He is the celebrated captain of a magnificent ship, cheered by his passengers, but he seems unaware that the men who own the ship and the officers who guard it have already made a secret pact to sink it. The monarchy had achieved its greatest moral victory, and in doing so had guaranteed its own political destruction. All the pieces were on the board. All that was needed was for one of them to make the final move. A grand building, my ruler, can stand for a very long time, even after its foundations have begun to rot. It can maintain its majestic facade, its flags flying, its windows gleaming, giving the illusion of strength and permanence. But inside, the structure is groaning, and the slightest tremor can bring the whole thing crashing down. Such was the state of the Brazilian Empire in the year 1889. For nearly 70 years it had stood, a towering exception in a continent of republics. But as we have seen, the great pillars that had held it aloft for so long had been systematically destroyed, leaving the crown to hang, impossibly, in midair. Let us recount one last time the crumbling of these foundations. The first and most powerful pillar was the great landowning class, the coffee barons. For decades, they had been the monarchy's staunchest allies, the economic engine of the nation, their loyalty bought with titles and secured by the protection of their single most valuable asset, their enslaved workforce. But the Golden Law, that great moral triumph we spoke of, was, for them, an unforgivable act of betrayal. The monarchy had liberated the enslaved, and in doing so, had liberated the planters from any remaining loyalty to the crown. Their support curdled into a cold and vengeful fury. These men, the richest and most powerful in Brazil, now saw the monarchy as their enemy, and they began to write generous checks to fund the newspapers and the politicians who promised to bring it down. The economic pillar was not just cracked, it had been pulverized. The second pillar was the Catholic Church. For centuries, the throne and the altar had been intertwined in Brazil, a sacred alliance that gave the emperor a divine legitimacy. But the unfortunate conflict over the Freemasons and the Pope's authority, the Questão Religiosa, had poisoned this ancient relationship. The emperor, in asserting his legal power over the bishops, had won the battle but lost the war for the devotion of his own clergy. The Church, feeling persecuted and disrespected, had withdrawn its spiritual support. It would no longer be a bastion of monarchism. When the final crisis came, the priests and bishops would simply stand aside and watch it fall. The moral pillar was gone. And that left the third and final pillar, the one upon which all states ultimately rest, the pillar of force, the military. As we have seen, the army that returned from the Paraguayan War was a new and dangerous creature. It was proud, professional, and deeply infected with the Republican and positivist ideas that saw monarchy as an irrational relic of the past. A series of petty squabbles over honor and protocol, the Cuestión Militar, had escalated into a complete breakdown of trust between the army's leadership and the emperor's civilian government. The army no longer saw itself as the defender of the throne, but as the vanguard of a new modern Brazil, a republic built on order and progress. The final pillar was not just cracked, it was actively pushing against the structure it was supposed to uphold. So there you have it, my ruler. In the space of 2 decades, the emperor had managed to alienate the people with the money, the people with the prayers, and the people with the guns. It is, by any measure, a difficult political situation to recover from. Adding to this structural rot was a deep sense of personal fatigue at the very top. Dom Pedro II was now an old man in his 60s. The vigorous, endlessly curious scholar had become a stooped, white-bearded figure, suffering from diabetes and a profound weariness of spirit. After 50 years on the throne, he seemed tired of the endless political games, tired of the burdens of a crown he had never asked for. He was still personally respected, even loved by the common people, but he was seen as a man of the past, a living symbol of an era whose time was coming to a close. The future, in the form of his daughter and heir, Princess Isabel, did not offer much hope to the elites. While the masses had hailed her as the redemptress for signing the Golden Law, the powerful saw her with deep suspicion. The planters, of course, would never forgive her. The military saw her as too devout, too close to that alienated church. And many in the political class were wary of her French husband, the Count of Eu, spreading whispers that a third reign under Isabel would really be a reign of a foreigner. The prospect of the future was, for the powerful, as unappealing as the reality of the present. In this vacuum of power, the conspiracy to found a republic became the worst-kept secret in Rio de Janeiro. Republican journalists openly called for the overthrow of the monarchy. Army officers met in their clubs to debate the shape of the new government. Resentful planters plotted with ambitious politicians. Everyone knew something was coming. The government seemed paralyzed, ruled by a kind of fatalistic inertia, as if they were simply waiting for the inevitable to happen. And so the empire drifted into its final days, a hollowed-out institution, a government ruling by sheer habit. It was a monarchy without monarchists, an empire with no true supporters left. It was a grand, majestic tree, its leaves still green in the sun, but its roots had been severed one by one, and it was standing in loose soil, ready to be toppled by the first strong gust of wind. And that wind was now beginning to blow. The great hollowed-out tree of the Brazilian Empire, which we saw at the end of our last night together, did not have to wait long for the final push. As the year 1889 drew to a close, a new prime minister, the Viscount of Ouro Preto, came to power. He was a man of energy and a staunch loyalist to the crown, and he could see the open insubordination of the army for what it was. In a desperate attempt to reassert civilian authority, he began to order the transfer of the most troublesome Republican-leaning army units to remote posts in the far corners of the empire. For the military conspirators, this was the final provocation. They decided that the time to act was now, before their network could be dismantled. The plotters, led by the positivist ideologue Benjamin Constant, knew that for their coup to succeed, they needed more than just ideas. They needed a figurehead, a military leader of such immense prestige that the rest of the army would follow him without question. And there was only one man who fit that description, the hero of the Paraguayan War, the aging and highly respected Marshal Deodoro de Fonseca. But Deodoro was a problem. He was a gruff, honest soldier, not a political intriguer. He was personally fond of the old emperor, and while he despised the civilian politicians, he had no deep commitment to the idea of a republic. He was a reluctant revolutionary, On the tense evening of November 14th, with Deodoro still wavering, the Republican conspirators deployed their most effective weapon, a well-crafted lie. A fellow plotter rushed to the marshal's home in a state of manufactured panic. He brought urgent news. The Prime Minister, Uro Preto, had just signed a secret order for the arrest of both Deodoro and Benjamin Constant. It was a complete and utter fabrication, but in the paranoid atmosphere of Rio, it sounded plausible. The lie worked perfectly. The old marshal's pride was wounded, and his fear for his comrades was stoked. His hesitation vanished. He agreed to lead the troops in the morning. An entire empire, my ruler, was about to be brought down by a rumor about a piece of paper that never existed. And so in the pre-dawn hours of November 15th, 1889, history was set in motion. Deodoro, who was genuinely ill and suffering from a severe attack of dyspnea, or shortness of breath, dragged himself from his sickbed. He put on his marshal's uniform, mounted his horse, and led a small column of soldiers from the military academy through the quiet, misty streets of the capital. It was not a thundering revolutionary army. It was a few hundred men, marching in orderly columns. The people of Rio who were awake at that hour watched the procession with mild curiosity. It was a common enough sight. They assumed it was just another military parade. The column marched to the Campo de Santana, the main square where the army headquarters and Ministry of War were located. The soldiers surrounded the ministry building, where the cabinet was in session. There was no battle. Not a single shot was fired in anger. The Prime Minister and his ministers looked out the window, saw the soldiers, and understood that the game was over. They were deposed. Marshal Deodoro, having accomplished his stated goal, sat upon his horse, and according to a number of witnesses, gave a cheer. Viva Sua Majestade, O Imperador! Long live His Majesty the Emperor! And with that he considered the morning's work to be done. The civilian Republicans were horrified. Their great military champion had just deposed the government but had left the monarchy itself entirely intact. It was a coup that had stopped halfway. What followed was a day of frantic, almost farcical political maneuvering. Benjamin Constant and the others spent the afternoon in a desperate effort to convince the ailing, grumpy marshal to finish what he had started. They warned him that if he stopped now, the emperor would simply appoint a new prime minister, likely a great rival of Deodoro's, and he and all his followers would be arrested for treason. They pressured him, they cajoled him, and they argued that it was too late to turn back. Finally, worn down by their arguments and his own illness, the old soldier relented. Late that afternoon, in a quiet and deeply unceremonious gathering at the municipal hall, a proclamation was read out. A provisional Republican government was declared, and Marshal Deodoro da Fonseca, a man who had woken up that morning intending only to topple a cabinet, found himself, by dinner time, signing a document as the leader of the new Republic of the United States of Brazil. All the while the Emperor, Dom Pedro II, was at his summer palace in the mountain city of Petropolis. When the first news of the revolt reached him, he dismissed it as just another military squabble. By the time he understood the gravity of the situation and traveled down to the capital, it was too late. The city was calm, the Republic had been declared, and the government was in the hands of the plotters. He found that he had no one to call upon. No politician, no general, no powerful faction would risk a civil war to defend a monarchy that no longer had any true believers. Faced with this bloodless fait accompli, and wishing to avoid any violence, the old emperor accepted his fate with the same weary, stoic dignity with which he had lived his life. There had been no great cry from the people, no storming of the palace, no epic battle for the future of the nation. 89 years of imperial rule, an entire era of Brazilian history, had been brought to an end in a single, quiet, almost bureaucratic day, a revolution that the public had largely watched from the sidewalks, as if it were a parade after all. The empire, without any supporters left to hold it up, had simply ceased to be. The Brazilian Republic was born in silence, in a coup so quiet that most of the country did not even know it had happened until the next day. The new leaders of this new republic, however, were not celebrating. They were nervous. The emperor was still in his palace in the center of Rio de Janeiro. He was old, He was ill, but he was still Dom Pedro II, a man who, for half a century, had been the living symbol of the nation. They knew that he and his daughter, Princess Isabel, were still genuinely popular with the common people. They feared that if the emperor remained, his very presence, that quiet dignity and magnificent white beard, might be enough to spark a monarchist counterattack. The republic, they decided, could not be truly safe until the emperor was gone. And so the first major act of the new republican government was not a grand decree on liberty or a bold new plan for the nation's future. It was instead a hasty and rather graceless eviction notice. In the dead of night following the coup, a military officer was dispatched to the palace. He carried a cold, formal letter, informing the imperial family that they were hereby banished from their homeland and had 24 hours to leave Brazilian soil forever. Imagine the scene, my ruler. The imperial family, including the frail old emperor and the princess who had just freed the nation's enslaved, being awakened in their beds by soldiers. They are told to pack a few belongings, to gather what they can of a lifetime spent in service of this country. They are then escorted under military guard through the dark, sleeping streets of their own capital, not as royalty, but as state prisoners being taken into exile. There was no final procession, no tearful public farewell. Their departure was a furtive, melancholy affair, designed to happen before the city and its loyalties could awaken. They were taken to a steamship waiting in the harbor. As Dom Pedro II, the second and last emperor of Brazil, walked up the gangplank, he looked back at the shores of his beloved country. He saw the dark, silent silhouette of Sugarloaf Mountain against the first hint of dawn. He was a boy of 5 when he had inherited this throne, a boy left behind when his own father had sailed away. Now, after a lifetime spent trying to hold this vast, complicated nation together, he was being sent away in turn. He knew, as the ship's engines began to churn, that he would never see this land again. The new government, in a gesture that was either magnanimous or simply designed to hasten their departure, offered the family a large sum of money as a pension. Pedro from the ship sent back a formal written reply, politely refusing to accept it. He would not be paid by the men who had taken his country from him. The journey to Europe was somber. The arrival was tragic. Just over a month after landing in Portugal, the Empress Teresa Cristina, Pedro's devoted wife of 46 years, died of a sudden illness. The emperor was devastated. He and his children were convinced that the official cause was not the real one. They believed she had died of a broken heart, of the sheer crushing grief of being violently torn from the only home she had ever truly known. Now utterly alone, Pedro made his way to Paris. He did not seek out the company of other exiled European royals. He did not live in a grand palace. Instead, he took modest rooms in a hotel, a lonely old man in a foreign city, and he spent his final 2 years doing what he had always loved most. He walked the city's streets, a stooped, anonymous figure. He attended lectures on history and science at the Sorbonne. He spent his days reading in the great libraries of Paris. He was an emperor without an empire, a king without a kingdom, but he was a scholar to the very end. In the winter of 1891, at the age of 66, he fell gravely ill with pneumonia. As he lay dying in his simple hotel room, his mind was on the country he had lost. His last reported words were a whispered wish for the happiness and greatness of Brazil. He had made one final poetic request of the few loyal friends who remained with him. He asked that, when he was laid in his coffin, a small pillow filled with soil from every province of his lost empire be placed under his head. It was the last desperate gesture of a man who longed to rest, in death, upon the land he could never again touch in life. And so, the story of the Empire of Brazil comes to its quiet end. It was a story that lasted 89 years, a unique monarchical experiment in a hemisphere of republics. What was its legacy? It held together a vast continent-sized nation, saving it from the fragmentation that befell its Spanish-speaking neighbors. It oversaw a long period of internal stability, progress, and the creation of a unified Brazilian identity. And it was the government that, in the end, finally abolished the great crime of slavery. But it was also, for most of its life, an undemocratic oligarchy, a state whose stability was built on the backs of enslaved millions. It was a system that failed to address the profound inequalities of race and class that would continue to haunt the republic that followed it. It was, in the end, a story of grand contradictions, a story of a court that fled one Napoleon, only to see its heir become a new kind of emperor. A story of a boy who cried for independence and the man who was exiled for being too much like his father. A story of a scholar who was given a throne he never wanted, who ruled with quiet dignity for half a century and died a lonely man in a Paris hotel. And the story of a princess who freed a people and in that single righteous act brought her own dynasty to an end. And now, my sleepless ruler, our long night is over, the tale is told. You may finally rest.